Chapter 12. Memories. Excuse me, Commander General? Do you have a moment? Naruto looked up from his desk, relieved for the distraction, even if he'd never admit it. The Mizukage was leaning slightly inside the flap to his command tent, looking at him expectantly. Of course, Mizukage-sama. Come in. Nodding quickly, the graceful woman moved into the tent, sealing the flap behind her, and then performing a brief hand sign to enable the privacy seals. The seals were known between all of the Kage and Jonin commanders for when they needed to make tough decisions. Unfortunately, they were the only two combat-capable Kages remaining, since the others were either dead, crippled, or missing. We're alone now, Naruto. Since it's just the two of us, I think we know and respect each other enough that we can use our names. One of the blonde's eyebrows raised a bit as he looked at her curiously for a moment, but he decided to go along with it since there was no real reason to refuse. They were fairly close due to necessity more than any real desire to be, at least from his perspective. There was no denying that Mei was a very attractive woman, but due to the way he grew up. Not to mention his mentors. He was firmly of the look, but don't touch mince it. Unless they wanted to be touched, that is. If that's what you desire, Mei, Naruto said, leaning back in his chair. He waited for her to acknowledge him using her name and then explain what she wanted to talk about, but the slightly older woman was staring off into space, an almost dreamy, he guessed, look on her face. Naruto wasn't sure what was going on, so he cleared his throat in hopes of getting her attention. When that didn't work, he shrugged and went back to checking assignments, figuring she'd talk when ready. It was nearly a full minute later when he heard her move and he spotted her hands resting on the other side of his desk, over the edge of one of the papers he was looking at in his hands. Upon looking up, he paused for barely a moment as she was leaning over the desk and her cleavage was almost perfectly eye level. Knowing better than to linger, he kept looking up and almost did a double take at the rather sensuous look she was staring at him with. Naruto. She began with such a breathless voice it sent shivers down his spine. There are many things that I desire, and hearing my name spoken by you is a simple one that you have now fulfilled. I have another desire, however, and that is to go back to Mist as I have been hearing some rumors that I feel need my attention. The blonde frowned internally, trying to keep his face impassive as he leaned back in his chair. If she went, that would pretty much leave him as one of the last remaining of the Kages. Sure, the Raikage was still around to a certain degree, but since he had been crippled he had gone back to Cloud weeks ago, spending his time gathering as much intelligence as possible while shoring up the village's few remaining defenses. As the days dragged on, however, the ability to gather knowledge dwindled as more and more people succumbed to the Red Moon. Not to mention that a report from Kumo was nearly 2 weeks overdue. Moving forward and propping his elbows on his desk, he rested his chin against his fists and looked up at Mei's face, trying to avoid looking at her obvious presentation. She was literally leaning halfway across his desk now, and her arms were pushing together against her chest to make it stand out even more. He was sorely tempted to stare, to hell with any consequences. But he had a sneaking suspicion that Mei would let him get away with doing almost anything. As for the reason why, he was still trying to piece that together. How long do you think you'll be gone? He asked. As long as necessary, was her immediate response. He couldn't help sigh. That means I'll probably never see you again. Yes, that is something I had considered. I felt I should at least give you the opportunity to try to convince me out of leaving, if you feel it is necessary. Naruto let his head tilt forward as he closed his eyes. He really couldn't think of any reason to keep her here. It was already a war of attrition, sometimes it only felt like they were delaying the inevitable. Toby's thralls had them outnumbered 100 to 1 already, and it was only going to get worse. The only real advantage they had is that they could still think for themselves, whereas the thralls pretty much had to be controlled by Toby, and even he could only control so many at a time. All attempts at tracking Toby down to finish him or destroying obelisks powering the Genjutsu had been fruitless. Efforts were now being made to find alternatives, and a tip from the recently deceased Tsuchikage seemed to be the best bet. The hardest thing now was getting to use a Shiigakure. The remains of it, anyway, while trying to keep hidden what they were looking for. Opening his eyes and leaning back in his chair once again, he nodded at Mei, who had since stood up again but now had her arms folded under her breasts as she stared at him with her uncovered eye. He squelched the sudden burst of curiosity that he always got when he wondered why she kept her other eye hidden. Well, it will be a shame to lose one of the best and most beautiful kunoichi we have, not to mention that you're Mizukage. But I understand where you're coming from, If we were far from Konoha and I heard negative rumors, I'd want to check on them too. Good luck, and hopefully we'll meet again." Her posture changed immediately, from somewhat relaxed to rigid, and instead of staring off into space like last time, her head tilted forward enough so that he could no longer see her eye. He was about to ask if something was wrong, but she spoke before him. Did you? What you said, did you really mean that?" Naruto was trying to figure out what her problem was, if it was a problem, so honesty was likely the best approach. "Yes, I wouldn't have said it if I didn't mean it. I'm really beautiful?" The blonde's mouth opened and closed wordlessly for a second before he nodded and snorted out that anyone who doesn't think so is obviously blind. It didn't take much thought on the matter in the first place. They were only about a decade and a half apart in age, no big deal for Shinobi, and if he actually had some free time he might have asked her to go get dinner sometime, dinner that wasn't ramen too. The more he thought about it though, the more ironic it was, because if it wasn't for the war changing his personality and having them work together, he probably never would have met her in the first place. At least not until he made Hokage under his own merits. Mei visibly relaxed as he mused about their current situation. She looked back up, immediately searching out his eyes. She smiled, though it was feigned, and even let out a small laugh. "You're the first real man to tell me that to my face, would you believe that?" He didn't, or at least wasn't sure what she meant by a real man, and his face showed it. "You've got to be kidding." She laughed again, though there was no humor in it. "No, I'm not. I've overheard men comment about me when they didn't think I could hear, and after threatening to kill them, if they couldn't say those things to my face, it stopped completely." Naruto could imagine that they likely didn't exactly speak tactfully when talking amongst themselves. Kiba was a prime example. Knowing how powerful she was, though, threatening them with death likely made them keep quite a distance. Well, with how powerful you are, threatening them with death probably scared anyone off that wanted to say it directly to you. She nodded slowly, then began to turn away. Naruto thought she was going to leave, so he leaned over to deal with the assignments again. Her footsteps sounded like she was moving away, but then they moved closer before moving away again. Looking up, he saw that the Mizukage was literally pacing back and forth inside the command tent. The blonde watched her for a moment with a raised eyebrow before going back to his work yet again. He didn't bother timing how long she paced, but it didn't feel like very long before she had her hands on his desk again and was leaning forward. He looked up in surprise as she had leaned most of the way across the desk this time. Any further and their noses would be touching, so he slowly leaned back in his chair to give them some space. "Naruto." Mei, he stated her name with little inflection, wondering what in the world was going on. When he actually looked at her face now, though, she wasn't meeting his eyes and was instead looking down as she leaned over his desk. Though he couldn't tell clearly, it looked like she was blushing. I've never thought about, quite like this before. Do you want to?" Naruto's mind was going a mile a minute. He had never seen Mei acting like she was now. He had an idea about what she was asking, but figured it was best to be sure. "Do I want to?" "What? Idiot." She looked back up towards his face sharply, her expression a mix between anger and want. "Are you going to make me spell it out for you?" Naruto bit back a chuckle, but the mirth must have shown on his face because she scowled at him, but it looked rather cute because she was clearly blushing. He wasn't the obtuse teenager he used to be anymore either. War could make a person mature quickly, and the fact that he was put in charge only sped it up more. Relationships were something he was never good at, though during war it didn't really matter. Especially not when Kunoichi started coming to him, because they were curious just how powerful he really was. Needless to say, he lost the last of his innocence after rescuing what he thought was a rather timid Suna Kunoichi from being killed by her squadmate who fell to the genjutsu mid-mission. He quickly found out that night she wasn't very timid at all. Her thanks kept him quite occupied during what would have otherwise been free time for the next few days. Bringing his mind back to the present, the fact that he was powerful enough to be able to fluster a Kage was not lost on him. After she scowled, he couldn't help but smile and retort, "No, I have a rather vivid imagination. Would you like to hear what I'm imagining right now?" Mei's visible eye widened for a moment before she let out a low giggle of her own and started to climb over the desk. "No. In fact, I think you should just shut up. Otherwise, well." Mei licked her lips, almost to his side of the desk, "I'll have to kill you." The Mizukage didn't give him a chance to say anything further anyway as she leaped at him from the desktop. His chair wasn't built to support both of them, and he was only vaguely aware of his back and head hitting the ground with Mei on top of him. The small flash of pain was ignored in favor of the better feeling of her lips pressing against his, followed by her tongue entering his mouth. One of his last rational thoughts before instinct took over was that he was glad she had activated the privacy seal as she entered the tent. They were definitely going to need it. Though perhaps she had planned this all along. Meanwhile in the past. Naruto-sama, here are the files you requested. The blonde turned to acknowledge and thank his assistant. That was fast, Mei-san. The teenager with shoulder-length auburn hair gave her boss a quick smile. It might have lasted longer, but Naruto didn't bother to wait and see as he quickly shuffled through the papers he had been handed. There was currently a zoning dispute between two of the lesser-known clans that had arrived in Konoha, which he was trying to resolve by pulling up the original plans. Well, you did ask me to file everything pertaining to the new clans, remember? It's only natural that I remember where I put things. Naruto tossed the younger girl a brief grin before focusing on the sheets of paper once again. She had been hovering around him more than usual for some reason since he got back from his mission. He hadn't really heard any rumors surrounding himself and Makoto yet, but that didn't mean there weren't any out there that he wasn't aware of. Refocusing his thoughts on the papers in his hands again, sometimes he felt having to do all this stuff was a real nightmare, but unfortunately he had pretty much brought all this on himself by getting the clans into Konoha in the first place. Even though the mission was technically a success, he had to hand it for Saratobi pulling one over on him when he had asked for Naruto to handle the arrivals. This was a logistical nightmare. Lately he'd found himself missing his somewhat innocent youth, having not to worry about anything but people giving him the cold shoulder. Now though? They all wanted his attention. It wasn't even this bad when he had been Hokage briefly during the war, though to be fair at that point he had plenty of capable people under him that were able to make decisions without needing his input. He was certainly appreciative of the Terumi clan and all the help they had provided, essentially working as an umbrella clan of sorts to funnel any issues through. The other clans that had left Kiri for Konoha would present issues to the Terumi clan for a potentially speedy resolution without needing to involve other clans of Konoha, Naruto, or the Hokage himself. Unfortunately, this zoning issue was one that went over the capabilities of the Terumi to solve, therefore Naruto was called upon to deal with it. If he didn't nip it in the bud now, it would have to be dealt with in Konoha's General Council, and that was a whole other mess that he was hoping to completely avoid. Konoha's General Council was pretty much what it was described as: a council of clans that handled a large portion of the day-to-day issues of the village. Obviously there was way too much happening in a hidden village for the Hokage to handle every single issue. The military angle was taken care of by the Anbu commander, the head of torture and interrogation, Jonin commanders and various elite Jonin in the force. The civilians were watched over by the General Council. While the council had no say whatsoever in military matters, it was essentially the group that handled all the requests and issues from the civilian sector. Even with that, however, the Hokage still had the final say in any matters concerning the village, civilian or otherwise. It was much the same way for the Fire Lord, who appointed governors, mayors, and generals to handle other towns, villages, and the country's foot soldier military. The clans of Konoha did the same for the Hokage. While Naruto didn't remember the lesson from the academy, he did remember Shikaku beating the lesson into his head once he was given the position of Hokage. Though the Fire Lord and Hokage of Konoha were said to be of equal footing in the power hierarchy, it all depended on how you wanted to look at it. From a pure power perspective, the Hokage won the power struggle without a doubt. A single skilled shinobi could wipe out dozens of regular foot soldiers while barely breaking a sweat. The Hokage alone could wipe out entire armies. Yet from another perspective, a hidden village could only last so long without proper funding. Funding that the Fire Lord was able to provide. Essentially, the hidden villages were paid protection to the countries they were located in. Some may see it as a bribe, while Naruto tended to see it in a more pragmatic light. The village needed the funds to survive, and in turn, protected the source where those funds came from. It went without saying that the lords of their respective countries were rather dismayed whenever armed conflict between villages happened because the entire country got dragged into it whether they wanted to or not. No smart lord was going to abandon their own hidden village. The only country that even came close one time was Wind, but that was mostly because Sandaime Kazekage was missing without a replacement for a long time, and the Yondaime was seen as too young and incapable. More and more business had been granted to Konoha up until the failed invasion. If not for his eventual friendship with Gaara, Naruto knew son Agakure may have eventually been abandoned. Naruto looked around for a moment, heading towards one of the construction groups, where the two clan representatives still looked to be bickering. The one thing he didn't really care for about representatives like these is that, while they were arguing for what they felt was best for their clan, they typically weren't the leaders of said clans, nor were they in any real position of authority. They just argued to see who could get fed up first, then left to report to whoever was in charge. The same kind of things happened in general council meetings all the time. Luckily there were some ways to stop it, especially once the higher authorities in the council got involved. There were 3 levels to the general council, though some joked that there were 3.5 because of the Hokage's advisors, made up of the Anbu and torture and intelligence heads, the Jonin commander, and anyone else of the Hokage's choosing. Sarutobi had chosen his old teammates and Shimura Danzo. Naruto had chosen Nara Shikamaru and Shizune. While the Hokage was at the top of the tier and had the final say in everything, those closest to the Hokage could certainly have an effect on swaying opinion. The second tier was made up of Konoha's 5 strongest clans. The Uchiha, Hyuga, Inuzuka, Aburame, and the Nara. 3 of the clans, Hyuga, Inuzuka, Aburame, formed the backbone of Konoha's hunting and tracking division, while the Uchiha pretty much staffed 2/3 of the Konoha military police. The Nara were the main suppliers of over half of Konoha's medical goods stockpile thanks to the huge forest preserve they maintained. The bottom tier was the lesser clans. They were technically the ones who handled most of the day-to-day issues. People from all walks of life, from the lowest beggar to civilian entrepreneurs, championed their causes before any one of the lower clans, offering things from future services to discounts to specialized goods so that the lesser clan would either deal with an issue directly or go to the general council for resolution. The clans all managed to check each other so that no one went out of control, but just in case one did, either one of the second-tier clans would step in. Or in some extreme cases, even the Hokage would. In most cases, members of the general council were the leaders of their clan, but those that chose not to often had clan members elect from within to represent them in the council. The last clan to be promoted to the second tier was the Nara about 2 years ago, while the Terumi had just been added to the council on the lowest tier right before Naruto had left on his mission with Makoto. This little spat, however, had gone beyond anything the Terumi clan was capable of solving directly. Hence his current presence. The general council could have solved it, certainly. But not within any reasonable time frame. For the last time, it had already been decided before you even showed up what our boundary would be. It isn't fair for you to come along and change it now. Be that as it may, it was also stated that the boundaries would be adjusted as needed depending on population requirements. You are aware that our clan members outnumber yours by quite a margin. Only when you include those families who are in service to your own clan. If you only count legitimate members of the Housen, then you have less members than us. Now see here. Naruto let their voices fade out slightly as he watched them continue to bicker. The poor construction foreman nearby was leaning against a crate which looked to have building plans scattered about on top of it. His face was covered by one of his other hands as his head slowly shook back and forth, likely getting rather upset about how this whole thing was playing out. The 2 clans involved were the Housen and the Kayamizu. Both were relatively skilled with water techniques, though in different ways. The trait that the Housen clan had allowed them to manipulate water in living things, though it only worked well on plants. Many people mistook this ability as one that allowed them to control plants directly, and when they were introduced to Hiruzen, he nearly mistook them for having a bastardized version of Mokuton. One of the things that they used their skills for quite often was to build boats, housing, furniture, and weapons, as they could manipulate wood in ways a carpenter could only imagine. With forests surrounding their new home, it was very easy for them to fit right in, and they were already popular with construction crews. The Kayamizu had the ability to manipulate water in such a way as to make it hard, causing it to take on a rather crystalline appearance, likely making any random opponent think it was something other than water. They could essentially make it solid without having to freeze it, like the Yuki clan did. Unlike the Housen clan though, their ability was typically only combat-oriented, like most of the other arrivals from Kiri. "Excuse me, honorable representatives. May I speak?" The 2 immediately stopped arguing and looked at him. The Housen representative immediately mellowed out, while the Kayamizu member simply looked even more exasperated. "I'm sorry you had to come out here, Uzumaki-sama, but as I'm sure you heard, we are having a bit of a disagreement. My colleague here feels that they aren't." "Hey! Don't go speaking for me." You should know that. Silence. Naruto shouted, projecting a small amount of killing intent to make sure that the order was followed. Both representatives immediately closed their mouths and turned to face him again, paling as they did so. Naruto had no idea if they were civilians or shinobi, but either way they were giving him a headache. Before I kindly asked if I could speak, not if someone would speak for me. This time, however, I will tell you that I am speaking. Do I make myself clear? The Kayamizu representative shakily nodded his head, but the Housen one opened his mouth to speak again. Naruto cut him off with a shushing gesture. SHH. You don't need to say anything at this point. Just shut up and listen. When both of them remained silent, he continued. Since I've heard it's been nearly an hour, and neither of you has been able to reach a mutual decision, and the Terumi clan cannot make a decision like this without further input from someone who is allowed to, I was called in to assist. Both of you know who I am. I'm the best you're going to get short of talking to Hokage-sama, so I'll be making your decision for you. This time the Kayamizu member looked about ready to say something, but quickly shut his mouth again when Naruto simply stared at him. The blonde offered the man a sardonic smile. Good. If you had said anything, I may just let this whole issue go languish in council proceedings for a month or more. Then when your clan heads come to you for explanations, you can tell them why. Grumbling, Naruto walked over to the crate where the building plans were, noticing the foreman quickly moving out of the way. The blonde simply nodded at the man, who returned the gesture with a shaky smile. Pulling out 2 sheets of paper from his own small stack, Naruto waved them at the representatives before slamming them down on top of the wooden box. There was a slight cracking noise from one side of the crate, and Naruto had to hold back a wince. He wasn't hurt, but he hadn't meant to slam his hand down that hard. Poor box. Making sure his features were set in a neutral mask, he turned back to look at the representatives once again. Here are both of the original agreements, written and signed by your respective clan heads. In the event of any disputes regarding clan boundary lines, an arrangement shall be made that will not inconvenience either clan. From looking at the plans and the boundary lines that you both want adjusted, I can give you 2 options. Gesturing them over, they quickly scuttled over to the crate, with the construction foreman following. Pointing at the lines with the various boundary lines, Naruto gestured at the first one. Now, if I'm reading this correctly, the Kaizumi want this line? Seeing the representative nod, Naruto continued, very well, then that means the Housen want the other line, which is reasonable, but not really needed as this land is technically being set aside for clan members only. Any sub-houses or clans are responsible for their own accommodations, which either have been built already or are in the process of being built now. If you want to have them in a clan-specific area, then your clan is more than welcome to buy further land or buildings in and around Konoha, as the Terumi and Kaguya have done. So here are your options. First, going by what I've said, you can leave the lines as they are. Secondly, you can take the area between the 2 specified lines and consider it joint clan territory. How you want to run it and build things there will be up to your clan leaders, but it is an open option if no other agreement can be made. I would have ruled in favor of the Kaizumi, but since you decided to modify the boundaries as well more in your favor as a response to the Housen, I won't. Those are your 2 options, gentlemen, work together or go back to the original plan. It shouldn't be too hard to figure out which one to pick. Though if this issue makes its way back into my office again, I'll have all the other clans that arrived here with you decide your fate. When he finished talking to the now abashed representatives, he gestured for the foreman to approach. The man did, if a bit slowly. Naruto simply shot the worker a disarming smile, hoping to ease any tension. Give them the rest of the day to figure this one out, eh? I figure they'll need to speak to their respective heads anyway. You and your men can have the rest of the day off, report back tomorrow. The foreman immediately smiled and thanked the blonde, swiftly moving off to let his workers know. Without another word, Naruto started walking away, weaving through various bits of construction and doing cursory examinations of new buildings he passed. His mind was currently a mix of thoughts, most of which were revolving around hope that he made the right decision regarding those 2. He'd seen way too many circular arguments like that in the past that would get nowhere because neither side wanted to back down. Sighing to himself, Naruto figured he might as well get something to eat since it was well past noon and he hadn't eaten yet. Maybe there was a chance he could stop by the Uchiha district later when he finished work and see if Mikoto wanted to go do something. After a few minutes of wandering, a light breeze brought with it the scent of freshly cooked ramen, and the blonde's mouth immediately started watering. From where he was approaching, He could see the stand ahead, and it looked like there was someone with red hair sitting there. Since the only person he knew of in the village with bright red hair like that was Kushina, he went ahead and called out for her. "Hey, Kushwaya." In the middle of calling out for her, his arm was grabbed and he was pulled into one of the nearby small alleys. Shinobi instincts immediately began to kick in as he tried to twirl out of the way, but in the process of trying to move, his back hit the stone wall of one of the buildings. Preparing to jump out of the way, he only stopped for a second when his eyes finally settled on just who it was that had pulled him into the alley. "Mei-san? What are you doing?" She still had a grip on his arm and grabbed his other wrist without him resisting. The look on her face was one that he had seen directed at him before from her, though many years in her future. "Naruto-sama. You were amazing back there." Back there? You mean with the representatives?" "Yes." Mei murmured before pressing her body up against his. Unlike Makoto, who was the same height as he was, Mei was a few inches shorter, like Kushina, and he found himself trying not to look down at her. "Mei-san, what are? This isn't right." "It isn't?" Mei's voice sounded more amused than anything else. "I know you've been looking at me. You have a hard time being discreet. Imagine how sad I was when I realized that you stopped looking at me this past week." Naruto found himself gritting his teeth. She had been with someone, so of course he stopped. Not only that, but he was with Makoto now. What happened to the shy girl he had gotten to know who had been helping him out for weeks? If it was just an act. Damn, she was a good actress. Maybe that's how she got the Mizukage spot. Her cunning in addition to her bloodline releases would make her a formidable enemy for anyone to face. Naruto tried not to sigh, instead opting for trying to convince her to take the high ground. "Mei-san, you were with someone. I stopped looking, as you put it, when I found out. Not only that, I'm with someone now." He heard Mei snort. "That man asked me out, thinking I was a timid little girl, that he could show the ropes. Let's just say that I showed him a thing or two when he tried to go further than I was willing. As for you being with someone, well, I want to prove that I'm better." Naruto couldn't help himself. He looked down to give the young woman an incredulous look. There was more going on here than he and Makoto dating on a whim, and besides, he wasn't that kind of person. As he opened his mouth to state as much, Mei took the initiative and moved forward again, pressing her lips against his in a hard kiss. Naruto could only stand there in shock, eyes wide, as he felt her tongue momentarily brush against his. As soon as he got his bearings and prepared to push her away, the pressure against his body and lips was gone, replaced by a sudden shriek that made him wince at the volume. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand and then frowning, Naruto looked to see what happened. He stopped looking around, completely shocked to see a mane of red hair that was waving about in front of him, separated into 9 equal parts. Terror immediately struck him, only for relief to immediately follow when he realized that she wasn't facing him. From what he could see around Kushina, Mei was staring at the red head in mixed parts fear and anger as she rubbed the side of her head. Apparently Kushina had pulled her by the hair, at least in part. "I heard everything. What are you doing to Naruto and Ikki?" Kushina growled out. Mei's eyes widened for a moment before she frowned. "And Ikki? I wasn't aware he had any siblings." Kushina's hair stopped waving about, and even though Naruto couldn't see her face, her voice was sounding smug. "I'm Uzumaki Kushina. You may have heard of me by another name." Once again her voice dropped down into a growl. Konoha's red-hot habanero. Recognition did dawn on Mei's face, though it was quickly masked by amusement. As the other young woman slowly climbed to her feet, Naruto saw her step into a stance that he recognized. It was one she often took up when she was getting ready to spew one of her bloodline techniques. "Red hot, you say? I wonder just how hot." Mei's mouth was open slightly as she talked, so that it looked like her tongue was a glowing orange color, not to mention the smoke that was starting to exit from the sides of her mouth. The smoke itself was of a bluish-green tint, so that was definitely the telltale sign of her boil technique. What the Terumi clan was known for. However, she had not unlocked the lava technique yet, at least not that he knew of. So was it beginning to show itself in an unconscious manner? He didn't get an opportunity to think upon it any further as Kushina was about ready to return the challenge. The blonde could feel both Kushina's and Kurama's chakra spiking. At least until Naruto put a hand on her shoulder. "Kushina-chan, Mei-san, stop." Kushina's head turned to look at his hand and then briefly at him with an upset expression before facing her opponent once again. "But Aniki." "No buts. Stop. You too, Mei-san. We don't need a scene, and you spitting out steam will definitely cause one." He heard Kushina gasp and mumble next to him as he took a step forward around her. Naruto stared at Mei, who was looking back and forth grumpily between him and the redhead. Growling, she shook her head before her cheeks puffed up and she spit out a reddish-brown glob onto the ground nearby. It quickly cooled, turning black. She was further along in her new technique than Naruto realized. He was tempted to ask about it but decided to clarify the situation instead before things got out of hand. Yes, Kushina is my little sister. She was stopping you because, like I said, I'm seeing someone now. I admitted already that I was interested in you before I saw you with someone else, but I stopped immediately after. You always struck me as shy, so I was planning on getting to know you a little better by having you as my assistant before I asked. I guess that's just how life works though. Mei was clearly frowning and had folded her arms under her chest, pushing it up slightly. So wait, you were interested in me before that other guy asked me? Naruto nodded slowly. Who are you with now? Naruto glanced over to Kushina, who was still staring at the auburn-haired girl, looking aggressive. Letting his gaze drift back over to Mei, he answered her, Uchiha Makoto. An Uchiha? Seriously? Once again, Naruto nodded slowly. Instead of being upset, angry, or any other reaction he had expected her to have, she instead grinned and pointed at him. Ha, I bet I can win you over from her. I know the Uchiha are strong, but she can't threaten me by copying my techniques and using them against me. You tell her that she now has Terumi Mei as her competition for the heart of Naruto-sama. Naruto found himself gaping in disbelief, and it was up to Kushina to try to make her stop. Naruto Iniki is already with Makoto ni. You can't interfere with that. Mei had turned to run off, but stopped short, turned around, and stuck her tongue out at Kushina. Who cares? In my opinion, until he's married, he's still available. When she finished, she looked at Naruto and winked. See you tomorrow, Naruto-sama. Naruto could only stare, still completely dumbfounded as Mei ran around the corner. As he began to pull out of his slight stupor, he idly noted all the other people that had been around, observing the incident, and were now whispering among themselves. It wasn't too hard to notice occasional glances of pity and jealousy from both males and females. Well, Kushina-chan. I guess I should warn Makoto-chan. What do you think? When he didn't get an answer, he turned to look where she was last standing, only to see she was no longer there. Kushina? Looking all around, he couldn't see her anywhere nearby. Without tapping into Sage mode, he couldn't really follow her either, as he was never really tracking her signature, and even with Kurama, it would take him a while to find her in the middle of the village. Sighing, Naruto remembered where he was and noted that there was only one empty stool left at the ramen stand. Putting everything else behind him to worry about later, he made his way forward to finally get his delayed lunch. The next morning, Naruto drummed his fingers on his desk as he examined the scroll Hiruzen had tossed him earlier when he first arrived. Part of him was expecting this, but another part of him was both surprised and flattered at what the scroll detailed. He wasn't sure why the soon-to-be old man didn't just tell him about this personally and could only guess that perhaps he was just too busy to handle the one-on-one briefing. Following a brief note congratulating and thanking him about resolving that minor issue yesterday in an efficient manner, Hiruzen wanted him to use those skills to take on either a genin team or an apprentice sometime soon. Probably once the war officially started, as Konoha's graduation period was approaching. Though he was a powerhouse and had shown Hiruzen and Danzo privately some of what he was capable of without going into Sage mode or Tailed Beast mode. Giving him a team meant they likely wanted to keep him out of the war itself as much as possible. He had also explained what it meant to be a sage. Hiruzen already knew, because all three of his students knew about being sages. Supposedly of the three only Jiraiya had been attempting it, he had seen some results but supposedly he was still not a full sage yet. The snakes did not want to teach Orochimaru, that much his student had confirmed, but he doubted that the smartest of the three would give up on the search. As for Tsunade, her response was that she just didn't care about it. Naruto didn't really find himself surprised, she didn't really care about anything after the loss of Dan and Iwaki. It probably wouldn't be long now before she left the village with the next war on the horizon. Naruto wasn't sure who he would take to train, all he knew is that he'd have to look through the class rosters first to see who was currently in school. Any further musings about who he would eventually train were interrupted when there was a knock on his door. A spike of annoyance left as quickly as it arrived, he seemed to be getting interrupted more and more often lately. It was probably worse for the Hokage. But then the Hokage had a secretary and a personal assistant. He couldn't help but belatedly chastise himself for when he was younger, as the number of times he must have barged in on the old man probably bordered the triple digits. "Come in." The door silently opened and an Anbu with a bird mask peered into the room. "Uzumaki-sama, Hokage-sama requests your presence as soon as possible." "I'll be right there." Naruto sighed as he stood up, closing the scroll as he did so. Leaving it on his desk, he wondered what he could be needed for already. He had just been there perhaps an hour ago, and it was very rare for him to be needed by Hiruzen more than once a day. Grabbing his vest from the back of his chair, the blonde headed for the exit. He'd find out soon enough. Naruto entered the Hokage's office for the second time that day and struggled to keep his face impassive, though he knew at least one of his eyebrows arched upward in curiosity. Upon first entering the room, his eyes automatically settled on Mikoto, who had likely turned to look at the door as it opened. She gave him a quick smile, which he returned, before she turned to face the Hokage again. His curiosity began to skyrocket as he looked around the rest of the room. Kagami was there, standing next to Danzo, and both of them looked to be chatting quietly, perhaps with a bit more animation than he was used to seeing from either of them. There were 3 other elderly men in the room, standing slightly off to the side. If he had to guess, based upon those he recognized in the room, they were Uchiha as well. Hiruzen had noticed that he entered the room and cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. "Naruto. Thank you for being prompt." The blonde nodded as he moved towards the Hokage's desk. He stopped in front of it and moved his hands behind his back. "You summoned me, Hokage-sama?" He noticed as Hiruzen's lips twitched upwards a bit before he quickly brought the impromptu smile under control. Naruto had come to appreciate their little inside joke and enjoyed getting reactions out of Sarutobi, if only because the man in front of him often griped about wanting to hand the hat over to Naruto right now. Nodding once, Hiruzen offered the blonde a slip of paper that was in his hand. "I had a petition land on my desk this morning. Since you're part of it, I brought you here." Accepting the slip of paper, he quickly perused the contents, trying to focus on important words and phrases. It didn't take long, as there was really only one important part to it. The Uchiha clan wanted to move forward with the marriage between Uchiha Mikoto and Uzumaki Naruto. Everything came sharply into focus as he realized that this was actually happening and not some dream. Part of him wondered just how much of what happened yesterday with Mei caused this to be accelerated the way it was. Making sure he was compassed, he nodded again and handed the paper back to the Hokage. "You need me here for the discussion?" "Yes." "Kagami?" Hiruzen waved his hand at the current head, who took a couple short steps forward, leaning slightly on his cane as he stopped in front of the Hokage's desk. "I swear I didn't see this coming when we were last here almost a year ago, Hiruzen." The Hokage leaned back in his chair as he folded his arms over his chest, chuckling. "Of course not. I don't think anyone did." His eyes flickered towards the 3 other Uchiha men standing off to the side, and Naruto saw Kagami not out of the corner of his own eyes. Regardless of the different viewpoints expressed by members of our elder council, everyone can agree that even though Uzumaki Naruto is not born of Uchiha blood, he meets any and all requirements that would be placed on any suitor for my daughter. Though he does not have the Sharingan, he has proven his capability in combat, having single-handedly defeated a young Sanbi Jinchuuriki. Naruto grimaced internally. He knew each generation was supposed to surpass the last, but he barely scratched the surface of what he was fully capable of. He understood that perhaps Kagami was probably trying to make it sound like what he did was impressive. Which it was, to an average shinobi. But he had long ago proved that he was anything but average. Well, in his time, anyway. He has also proved his abilities at diplomacy and management, being able to bring several new bloodlines into Konoha, as well as being able to assist in getting them fully integrated into the village proper. This has brought many new opportunities to both the village and our allies and has made our enemies reconsider any plans they may have been prepared to use against us in this time of instability. It is for these reasons that we wish for the bonding between an Uchiha and an Uzumaki. Kagami turned slightly to look at Naruto. "Our main request is that we wish for you, the suitor, to take the Uchiha name. The reason we are here before Hokage-sama is because we need his permission since there are only 2 named Uzumaki left in the village, and in the absence of clan leadership Hokage-sama has final say." Naruto hadn't heard anything about this before. He was admittedly a bit chafed about having to lose the name he had since birth, but there was something else that concerned him more at the moment. With a slight frown on his face, he looked between Kagami and Hiruzen asking the question at the forefront of his mind, what does this mean for Kushina? Technically, nothing, Hiruzen explained, a look of understanding on his face. Before I released you from my service, Kushina would already have been the last of the Uzumaki clan in the village. It simply meant according to village law she was required to keep her own last name when she married and give it to her firstborn son and daughter. Kagami continued when the Hokage finished, though we are willing to let any of your children who do not activate the Sharingan by their 15th birthday or a second daughter or third son take the last name Uzumaki as well, if you desire it. Naruto began to nod, but stopped short, a question popping into his mind. What if they manage to activate it after their 15th and have already changed their name? The blonde noticed as Kagami's eyes tracked over towards where the other Uchiha were who hadn't said a word yet were, before coming back to him. I would say we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, if we ever do. In all of our clan history, no one has ever activated their Sharingan after puberty. Should something happen, I believe we can let them remain in Uzumaki, keeping our ties with the clan rather close. Though I would hope you listen to what the clan advisors have to say regarding the situation, should it arise. Naruto's eyes tracked around the room to land on the three older Uchiha men. They stared impassively at each other for a few seconds before the blonde offered them a slight incline of his head. One of the men who was standing slightly in front of the other two nodded back, and Naruto knew the face of who he'd likely be dealing with the most. Facing the Hokage once more, Hiruzen stared at him impassively for a second before stamping and signing his name on a scroll in front of him. I have no issues with the request. The only thing left is for you to accept, Naruto. The Hokage turned the scroll around so Naruto could read it and pushed both it and a calligraphy brush over to the other side of his desk. As he began looking over the scroll, he realized it was pretty much everything they had just gone over. A million things began to flash through his mind as he realized that nothing would be the same at all anymore compared to the time he came from. He was a bit jittery and nervous, to be sure. He was essentially making it a certainty that the Itachi and Sasuke he knew would never exist. Deep down it made him feel rather uncomfortable, but by the same token, he knew that by taking this step, he would be making Konoha stronger than ever by keeping the Uchiha alive. It was, perhaps, what Itachi would have wanted all along. As for Sasuke, well, Naruto had all but given up trying to understand just what Sasuke wanted by the time they had their sixth and final fight. Then there was Makoto. He did feel sad that he never got to know her in his time, but he could say the same thing for his own parents. Any interactions he might have had with her in his own time may have colored his opinions of the woman she was now, be it good or bad. Much the same as it was with Kushina and Minato, getting to know them all now without having known them previously let him enjoy actually getting to know them as they really were, rather than how he could have believed they should be now. He was glad to get to know Makoto now, certainly. She wasn't overly sweet or hyper around him, nor was she rough and aggressive. She was at what he considered that perfect middle ground, almost like what he had settled into with Sakura during the war. Gracious to those who deserved it, and cool to those who had in some way slighted her. But somehow without being arrogant about it like he remembered Sasuke could be. At least if she didn't want to talk to you, she would tell you why, and not just grunt and ignore you. They had spent the last few days since their return hanging around each other as much as possible. It was more her hanging around him than the other way around, since he had plenty of work that was dumped on him upon coming back to his job. He was pleasantly surprised that the very next day, after she told Minato and Kushina the news about the two of them, she brought him lunch. It was ramen too, so she likely understood that the fastest way to his heart was through his stomach by using his favorite food. Not only that, but she would help him with what she could in his duties. When there was some downtime they chatted about clans, Minato, and Kushina, the state of the shinobi world, and pretty much anything else they could think of. Makoto had stated that the days she spent with him had easily surpassed any of the ones she spent with Fugaku, leaving him happy, but at the same time internally scowling at the other man. Too bad she wasn't around when Mei had advanced on him. Or maybe it was better that it was Kushina after all, who knows what Makoto would have done. At least Kushina was willing to listen to him when he made them stop. Naruto didn't think they were in love with each other yet, though he couldn't claim to be an expert at understanding the emotion. They had only known each other for about 4 months and known each other as more than mere acquaintances for maybe half of that. At the very least, he didn't believe he was in love with Makoto, but he couldn't speak for her feelings about him. He knew he liked her quite a lot and enjoyed spending time with her and definitely wanted to spend more time with her. A lot more time. It was at about that time his eyes finally reached the bottom of the contract. Something popped out that he had a hard time believing and that no one had mentioned to him. He didn't mind what it said, not really. But it made him want to examine the contract again to make sure there was nothing hidden in it that he overlooked. We have to get married in a month? Doesn't that seem rather… I don't know, sudden? Kagami grunted from nearby. Is that a problem? You're essentially taking the place of Fugaku. We even added a little extra time, otherwise it would have been happening in a little over 2 weeks. No problem, Naruto muttered, just didn't think I'd be getting married so soon. It's a bit of a wake-up call, is all. There was a chuckle to his right, and Kagami must have shifted over closer to him while he was reading, since a hand landed heavily on his shoulder for a moment. I'm certain Makoto will do everything in her power to help you prepare. Naruto turned to look at Makoto, who had also moved slightly closer to him during his musings. Her hands were clasped behind her back much like he did when he first entered, but instead of looking at him, she was busy staring a hole in the floor. Perhaps she was embarrassed, or maybe she was avoiding looking at him so he wouldn't feel guilted into anything. Perhaps she was even frustrated because of any rumors she may have heard about yesterday. He could find out later. Taking a deep breath as he looked at the scroll one more time, he grabbed a brush and tried to write his name a little more neatly than he normally would. This was a rather important document after all. The moment it was done and the brush had been set aside, Hiruzen grabbed the scroll and waved his hand over the ink to dry it. Meanwhile, Makoto had grabbed his right hand with both of hers. She had moved even closer and was now pressing her body against his arm as she held his hand. He was a little surprised by her affectionate action in front of all the others but didn't say anything. Naruto, I'll let you and Makoto have the rest of the day to yourselves. I think there are a lot of things you can and should tell her now about your work. Yes, Hokage-sama. Do you need me for anything before we go? Hiruzen shook his head and waved Naruto off. As the blonde was getting ready to ask Makoto where she wanted to go, he heard her murmur near his ear that she needed to talk to her father really quick, but that she'd meet him by the entrance to the building in a minute. Nodding, he gave her hands a squeeze before heading to the door, mentally going over what to tell her and exactly how to tell it. After meeting up again, they decided to wander around Konoha for a little while. Naruto asked to wander around the construction area for a bit just to make sure everything was in order before he actually got the day off. Everything seemed to be in order, in fact it seemed as if most of the construction workers had taken the day off too, and Makoto joked that the Hokage probably gave them the day off since Naruto wouldn't be around to handle any issues. That one group of workers he had talked to yesterday were lucky again today, if that was truly it. Whatever the case really was, Naruto put it out of his mind as he dragged Makoto towards his old stomping grounds. Or at least what they would be someday. Training Area 7. He had scoped them out not long after his arrival, just to see what it looked like. It did look much like he remembered, except for the fact that there were no training posts there yet. As one of the more open training grounds, it tended to be one of the less used than many of the others, which was always fine with him because most of his techniques required a lot of open space. Otherwise he'd be tearing up acres of forest. Dragging her through the area, they eventually encountered a comfortable-looking spot where he decided to sit down under the shade of a tree to keep them out of the glare of an early afternoon sun. Makoto joined him, sitting close and then resting her head on his shoulder. I wonder where I should begin telling you about everything. Makoto giggled briefly and grabbed one of his hands in hers. The beginning is usually a good place, or so I've heard. Naruto nodded, agreeing, yeah. But it's a really long story and will probably take a couple days to tell it all. I'm going to have to sum up a lot of things and then I'll clarify over time. Huh? Makoto had pulled back slightly to look at him. What have you done that could take that long to explain? Well, technically my beginning doesn't happen for about another 7 years from now. I was born after the Third Shinobi War, which will be starting up sometime in the next few months. The blonde wasn't sure if he should keep going or wait to see if Makoto would say or do something. So far she was just staring at him, blinking rapidly. When she didn't comment or even open her mouth to speak, he pressed on. I was born on October 10th, the same night that the Kyuubi was ripped free from my mother. The process killed her, and then to keep the Kyuubi from rampaging in the village, my father sealed it back in me. Now Makoto was staring at him with wide eyes. Naruto could do nothing more than nod and offer a sad smile. My parents in the future are Uzumaki Kushina and Namikaze Minato. They died the night I was born, and the Kyuubi was sealed into me. He wasn't sure if those were tears he started to see in her eyes, but he couldn't say anything anyway because she nearly leaped from her sitting position and crashed into him, knocking him over onto his back. Her arms wrapped around his neck and she whispered, I'm sorry, in his ear over and over. Apparently her grief over the loss of his parents in the future briefly overpowered any surprise she may have felt about his time traveling. Naruto had already been through many situations like this before during the war when he tried to comfort others, so he simply remained as calm as he could and gently rubbed her back over the vest she was wearing. It wasn't too long before she finally settled down, shifting her body to get more comfortable in a position that had her nearly half off, half on top of him. I never got to know them in the future, but I'm glad to get to know them now. I know this must be a lot to take in, and I wouldn't be surprised if you don't believe me. Or even if you still want to look at me the same way now. He felt her nod against his shoulder, where her head was currently resting. It is a lot to accept. I guess Hokage-sama believes you though, otherwise you wouldn't have been doing the things you have. Yes. Naruto chuckled, reminded of how surprisingly easy it was to get the people in charge to believe him, mostly thanks to the Yamanaka mind-walking techniques. I've told him about things that will happen which have come true and have already tried so manipulate some things to our advantage. All the clans from Kiri. They never came to Konoha in my time. I see. Mikoto took a deep breath and closed her eyes, the corner of her lips beginning to bend down into a frown. Have you already manipulated me? Naruto stared at Mikoto until she opened her eyes. She recoiled a bit, seemingly a little surprised at just how intense his stare was. I've done nothing that you haven't wanted me to do. I already promised nothing I know or have done will harm the Uchiha clan in any way, and that obviously includes you. Honestly, I only saw you 2 or 3 times from my time that I can remember. What? She looked completely confused. I wasn't the leader of the clan anymore? I'm guessing that I married Fugaku after all, right? She questioned, shivering slightly. Naruto could tell she didn't exactly look pleased about that thought. Yes, you and Fugaku married and had 2 sons. Itachi and Sasuke. Mikoto immediately sat up straight, eyes bright. Can you tell me about them? Even though she seemed excited, it quickly dimmed when Naruto didn't smile or even seem to match her level of excitement. Naruto. What happened to my sons? The blonde couldn't help but wince slightly, something she obviously noticed as her frown deepened. Itachi was a genius. Sasuke was too, in his own way. Unfortunately some stuff happened that sort of made things go badly for the both of them. I'm not sure it's a good idea for me to say anything, honestly. Are you really sure you want to know? She nodded almost immediately. As their mother one way or another, I believe I have that right. Part of Naruto wanted to refuse, after all they were the children of an alternate Mikoto from the one he was with. At least, that was the way he had started thinking of her. So technically she had no claim to them. But he really had no intention to upset her, so he just resigned himself to telling her the entire history from the beginning. In order for you to understand what happened, I need to give you a little more background. You see, after the Kyuubi was released from my mother and attacked Konoha, a lot of people began to distrust the Uchiha clan. Those who tried to subdue the Bijuu saw that its eyes were dull and under the influence of the Sharingan. Even though many Uchiha lost their lives that night, people still wanted to place blame. Naruto found himself struggling to press onwards as Mikoto began to pale. The Uchiha clan, as I'm sure you know, has always kept itself somewhat apart from the rest of the village. This didn't help, and it only got worse with time. I don't know what would have happened if the Yondaime was still alive, but with the Sandaime back in power, things began to slide backwards. Not that it was Sarutobi Jiji's fault, but I think by the time he got back in control of the situation, things with the Uchiha had been spiraling out of control for some time since the attack. Mikoto listened carefully as Naruto continued explaining the coup plot, which she had a hard time believing that she would have taken part in or even condoned. Since the blonde did not know her from his time, he couldn't even begin to understand what her mindset was like. So in order to keep the peace, Sarutobi tried to perform some sort of peace talks with the clan. Naruto waved one of his hands in an exasperated gesture. I don't know what the outcome of them really was, but all I know is that Itachi volunteered to kill his clan when the Konoha leadership was running out of options. He was 13. Mikoto's hand moved to cover her mouth after letting out a startled gasp. She was looking at Naruto with horror evident in her eyes, but the blonde figured the best he could do for her was to plow through it and not dwell on any one part of it. I don't know how many he actually killed, but I found out later that he had help. Somehow he got in contact with Madara. Or at least the man he believed was Madara. And had him help kill the clan. Itachi only killed his immediate family, his best friend, and his girlfriend. But he left Sasuke alive. Sasuke is complicated. Growing up he was my rival, my best friend, and my brother in every way but blood. Itachi had a plan for him, one that hinged on Sasuke killing him to redeem the clan. His plan might have worked, but Orochimaru got his hands on Sasuke, and after that he became a lost cause. Orochimaru? But he. Naruto held up a hand, stalling Makoto's interruption. He has already started up with his laboratories. Granted, as far as we can tell he reports everything he does and doesn't use Konoha natives or living people. Yet. That will change sometime soon during the Third War, and he'll start experimenting on war orphans. Hokage-sama hasn't decided how to handle it yet. Don't tell anyone please? I'm taking a big risk just by telling you. She nodded, somewhat meekly. After that, the two of them sat there in silence for a bit. Naruto figured that Makoto would probably need some time to absorb everything he told her. Surprisingly, very little time was needed before she started asking for more, beginning with one of the stories he dreaded telling the most. Sasuke. He began from their first encounters in the academy up through their final and sixth fight during the Fourth War. How their final fight had ended with Sasuke committing suicide, pointlessly using intense techniques that were aimed anywhere and exhausting his chakra while he bled out from injuries. Naruto did his best to comfort Makoto when she began to cry softly for the sons she never had or hadn't had yet. It was too confusing for him to think about. Of course, the discussion around Sasuke's death brought the Fourth Shinobi War into the picture, and Naruto spent most of the remainder of that afternoon explaining a little more about some of his own personal fights leading up to the war. Then he continued with what it was like to fight alongside shinobi from the other nations and what it was like to eventually end up leading that entire force. When he finally finished explaining everything about that war that he could think of right then and answered all of Makoto's questions, the sun was beginning to set, leaving the sky painted in various reddish hues. They had shifted between many different positions during the course of his storytelling, but had finally ended up to where he was sitting with his back resting against a tree trunk while Makoto was laying on the ground in front of him, her head in his lap. He had begun running his hands through her hair, grinning occasionally as she would let out a contented hum. It was right after he finished the tale about how he came back in time that she tossed a question at him that he had been expecting since the very beginning. Naruto, when are you going to tell your parents? He let out a sigh, knowing that he was conflicted enough about his decision already. He had no idea what Makoto would think, but apparently it was time to find out. At first, I wanted to right away. To hell with the consequences and all that. But after meeting both of them, I realized that they weren't the same people that I met very briefly in my seal when I fought Nagato. Dad. I mean, Minato was still serious, but he just seems a lot happier than he did during our brief encounter in the seal. I only got to meet him for a couple minutes though, so I can't say for sure what he was really like when he became Hokage. As for Kushina, she's really different. She was much more calm when we met in the seal, and I had much longer to talk to her when compared to my dad. She must have settled down a lot because she's really hyper now. I guess between dad getting the Hokage position and me being born it must have helped her calm down. It's a bit strange now since she keeps referring to me as her big brother. Every day it's been getting harder and harder to see her as my mother in the future. Maybe that's for the best? Naruto was slightly startled, he wasn't expecting Makoto to say anything. It must have shown on his face too, because when he looked down at her, she was grinning up at him. What do you mean? His future wife did a small shrug from where she was laying and closed her eyes as he resumed playing with her hair. Well, if you do come clean, it will be a bit odd for a man who is older than her to be calling her mom, don't you think? It's the same thing for Minato. I know it would be odd for me as your wife to be married to the son of my best friend. This is so complicated, Naruto sighed. I wasn't planning on telling Kushina anything until she was pregnant with, well, me. As for my dad, he'll know when he becomes Hokage, even if I don't say anything. I'll probably let him find out, then talk to him if he asks. Then there is also Kurama who I have to talk to, but we both agreed it would probably be a few years before I can do anything about his situation, sadly. Kurama? Kyuubi. Makoto made an O face, then let out a hum noise, shifting her weight so she could sit up. I can't really say anything about Kurama, But otherwise not telling Kushina or Minato just yet sounds reasonable. I'm also curious about your situation with how there can be two Jinchuuriki for the same Biju. We can talk about it more later, though. Because I'm starving. We haven't eaten all day. Not to ignore what you were saying about food, but I have to ask if you're okay before we go wandering around the village. Mikoto closed her eyes, nodding slowly. I'm still in a bit of shock, I think. But otherwise I'm fine. The things you've said. It's a lot to take in. I really don't want to talk about it anymore right now, okay? We'll have plenty of time to talk about it in the next month, and then forever beyond that. Naruto smiled a bit before returning the nod, knowing that they still had plenty to talk about. You're right. Well, let's go get something. You can choose. I want to go to the place where you first came to get me for that mission. Mikoto giggled at the look on Naruto's face as they both rose to their feet. Well, why would you want to take me there? Not that I'm complaining, but I didn't think you'd want to go somewhere that Fugaku has been with you. I want to show them I'm with someone better this time. His fiancée gave him a brilliant smile as she grabbed his hand in hers and began tugging him along. Besides, we need to get you to start making a good impression on the clan as a whole. Seeing you make me happy will go a long way towards getting a lot of others to respect you. I'm sure you know that, because you don't have the Sharingan, that you're going to have a hard time winning everyone over. I'll make sure everyone knows that I chose you, but that still doesn't give you a free pass, unfortunately. So I have to work towards acknowledgement? I've done it before, I can do it again. Naruto leaned forward, pulling her clothes from the hand he was holding, and stole a kiss that she seemed to be more than happy to give. I hope we didn't need to have a reservation. That looked like a pretty nice place. Mikoto giggled and kissed him again, this time on the cheek. If his story was affecting her at all, she was doing an excellent job of hiding it. Silly. Remember who I am? It's in our district, so I always have a reservation there whenever I want it. Let's go. 31 days later. Even if it was a bit of a hassle, he had somehow managed to avoid Mei for an entire month, or at least, had Mikoto with him when they did encounter her. Some of those encounters got intense and even rather, well, heated, but for the most part he had made it no worse for wear. It did need to be said that Mikoto had some incredible killing intent. That he could actually feel it surprised him, as after fighting in a war so long it took a lot for him to even feel what an average shinobi would consider a large amount. Not only did she have some incredible intent, but she didn't shy away from fighting either, if that's what it took. There was more than one occasion where he had to hold her back. Thank goodness Kushina was never around at the same time. Luckily he never had Mikoto's ire directed at him, so long as he kept himself out of Mei's grasp. It led him to being a little more aware of his surroundings in the village than he normally would have been otherwise, not to mention a rather judicious use of shadow clones, but he had managed. Needless to say, he felt that he had managed to keep Mikoto happy, his unique time travel circumstances notwithstanding. Her happiness was all that really mattered in the end. It took her most of the week, after he told her where he was from, for her to come to terms with things, but it spoke a lot to him that she was more looking towards the future rather than what had happened in his past. Not that she wasn't curious, she just didn't put a lot of stock in it. As she so eloquently put it, the timeline was already fucked up beyond all recognition. He'd have to remember that one. Maybe turn it into an acronym and use it in a witty sentence to his future students when Hiruzen decided to officially saddle him with 1 or 3. So how does it feel, being a married man at your age? Naruto turned his head to stare at Minato, giving him a sour look. Just fine, thank you. It is a bit surreal, but my wife is head of one of the most powerful clans in Konoha, you know. Whoa there, Minato held his hands up in a surrendering gesture. I didn't mean anything by it. I've already offered my congratulations, now as one of your still unmarried friends I get to joke about you tying the knot. Well, like I said, it is all a bit surreal. I mean, I've only really come to know everyone over the last 6 months or so. To think that we all met just because one day I sat next to you in a ramen stand. Minato shook his head, grinning. I think the fact that we look strangely similar and the fact that you are also. I mean, Weirian of the last Uzumaki pretty much made us friends whether we wanted to be or not. I don't have any problems with it, you're the best sparring partner I've ever had and are the only one who can keep up with me when I can use some of my more intense techniques. Not to mention you make a good test subject. Uchiha Naruto shot a mock glare at his best friend, but then nodded and closed his eyes, resting his head against the back of the chair he was sitting in. The legal ceremony to bind him and Makoto together as husband and wife had just happened about an hour ago. It was a small get-together, neither of them wanted to make a huge spectacle of it, which he was definitely thankful for. As was expected, he had asked Minato to be his best man, as well as his witness. Makoto had picked Kushina, who was bouncing off the walls with excitement the entire time, even if it was a closed ceremony. There were a few others there as well, like Hiruzen and his two old teammates, Akimichi Taichi, Danzo, Kagami, and the three Uchiha advisors that Naruto met in the Hokage's office a month ago. There were a few others there that he didn't recognize either, but his focus was stuck on Makoto for nearly the entire time. She had dressed up nicely, but it was tasteful and nothing exotic or extreme. It definitely showed off her figure that was typically hidden underneath her bulky Jonin attire, the figure that he had only seen for a couple days during their mission, when she was wearing her night clothes. Even when they went out in Konoha over the past month, she rarely wore anything other than her shinobi garb, and if she didn't it was always something conservative. He hadn't worn anything extraordinary, but apparently he did clean up rather well and looked good in nice clothing. When he wasn't on duty he usually only wore light t-shirts and shorts. Judging by the stares he got from Makoto and Kushina, who was trying not to look and failing, and comments from Kagami and Minato, he did indeed look very sophisticated when he actually tried to look nice. Other than their marriage preparations, explaining the future to Makoto, and trying to avoid Mei. A lot had happened over the past month. 2 weeks ago Earth Country formally declared war on Wind Country because Sun Agakure had been using a little more effort than necessary in searching for their lost Kazekage. The skirmishes between Suna and Iwa Nin, along Earth Country borders, and in their allies' territory had finally degraded into all-out battles. As a result of this, graduations had been pushed into fast forward, and many up-and-comers were being assigned to a rash of new Jonin instructors. Minato was one of those, and Naruto had to pretend to be surprised when Minato told their group he'd be getting a team of his own sometime soon. Naruto was still fairly curious who would be on his own team, unless he was simply given an apprentice. Oh, so this is where everyone is? Naruto immediately recognized the boisterous voice, turning to look over near the entrance to their room. Sure enough, Jiraiya was standing there with a big grin on his face and holding a book in his right hand. Jiraiya-sensei. Minato quickly stood from his chair and moved towards the door. Jiraiya met him halfway, giving his one student a handshake and a hearty pat on the shoulder. Naruto remained where he was, listening to the two of them talk about things Minato had been working on. When the conversation finally got around to what Jiraiya was doing in Konoha, Naruto decided to join in. You know me, Minato. Ever since you brats grew up, Saratobi-sensei has had me running about all over the place trying to find out as much as I can about what's going on. Since Earth finally declared on Wind, we're going to have to back them up as our ally. But he's sending me towards Lightning because we don't know what they're going to do. They're probably going to go after water, Naruto started with certainty, because he knew that's what they did in his time. Especially because of how much weaker they will be due to the loss of several of their more prominent bloodline clans. Even with the civil war there, they likely would have put aside most of their differences to defend their homes. Water tried to stay out of it, but you can't really stay completely neutral in a world war if someone doesn't want you to be. Jiraiya nodded slowly, both as an acknowledgement and a greeting. Naruto. Iro-senin. TCH, how many whatever he was going to say, was cut off as Minato started laughing. The white-haired sage simply turned to look at his student with horror. Not you too. I've already got Kushina-chan calling me that, and Makoto-chan doesn't try to stop her either. Sorry, sensei. Minato was trying to talk through his chuckles, but you have to admit, it fits you. Every time I hear it. It never gets old. Jiraiya grunted, then sighed, knowing he was now stuck with the nickname. Shaking his head, he glared briefly at Naruto before offering the book in his hand. I should be angry with you, but Minato is right, it does fit me. I can think of worse things to be called too. Anyway, this is a new work of mine and is still in an outline form, but I've finished the first scene. It might, give you some tips for tonight if you catch my meaning. Naruto accepted the book, already knowing what it likely was. Flipping it open, he recognized Jiraiya's rather neat scrawl immediately. This was still his original written copy. Interesting. What's it called? I haven't really thought much about that yet. I just want it to be a series of short stories. It's just something I've been working on in my spare time, anyway. I have another book that I've been working on for years already that I want to release first, I think. Do you two want to be the first to read it when it's done? Of course, sensei. Naruto simply nodded as he continued browsing through the manuscript of what would one day be the first of many Icha books. He felt a small smile tug at the corner of his lips as he remembered the many occasions where Jiraiya had stopped him during their travels to do his research and the usual hilarious results when he would raise enough of a stink to get Jiraiya caught. Look at that Minato. See that grin? I think he likes it. Naruto chuckled, nodding his head as he closed the manuscript. Yes, so far so good, Iro-senin. Maybe I'll Both of the men in front of him immediately paled, and Jiraiya immediately snatched the book out of Naruto's hands. Oh, on second thought, I think this book needs a lot more work before I show it to anyone. Ta. Jiraiya vanished from the room, and Naruto just stared at the spot where the man was before looking at the other blonde still in the room. All Minato could do was shake his head and sigh. Sensei has been scarred from when he was peeping on the women's hot springs, and Kushina and Mikoto were hidden in there. You don't want to know the things they said they would do to him if he were ever caught with or doing something perverse by either of them. Naruto couldn't help but chuckle and think wistfully about the past. Oh, I'm sure I can imagine. Anything further that would have been said between the two of them was cut off by another person appearing in the doorway, though this time it was a feisty redhead. Minato? Naruto and Ikki? What happened to Iro-senin? He looked at me and ran away crying. Both blondes looked at each other and shared a look before grinning. I think he took a joke of mine a little too seriously, claimed Naruto. He saw Minato nodding in his peripheral, and as if that was enough for her, Kushina simply hummed in agreement as she entered the room. First she moved over to Naruto a brief hug, whispering congratulations in his ear. Then she took a step back and winked at him. Mikoto ni said she'd be waiting for you at home, and Ikki. Naruto blinked at her owlishly for a moment before grinning, only for Kushina to blush and look away, then move towards Minato. He watched as she moved up and hugged Minato, but didn't let go, and left her head facing away from him as it rested against Minato's shoulder. Naruto pointed at her with a confused face, silently asking Minato if something was wrong. All he got from the other blonde was a small frown and a minute shake of his head, so he could only guess that either Minato didn't know or he wasn't going to say anything right now. You two have a good night. I'm going to follow Kushina-chan's advice and see how Mikoto is doing. See you later. He waved to them as he turned, not sure what was up with his sister, but figuring that Minato would be able to handle it. Idly registering their voiced goodbyes, his thoughts turned to his new wife and what she would want tonight. Mikoto? Naruto spoke loudly into the house as he closed the door behind him. Her father had given them their own place to live in on the head's grounds once they wed, and they could continue living there as long as they wanted, or at least until Mikoto took up the mantle as clan leader. Up here. He heard her voice come from near the stairs to the upper level. Their house was one of the few buildings on the Uchiha grounds that actually had more than one floor. Naruto wasn't sure if it was a matter of preference, necessity, or practicality. Having lived in an apartment for all of his life, he didn't really care one way or the other. Making his way up the steps, he saw that the door to their room was open, and as he approached he could see her sitting on the side of the bed, watching the door and waiting for him. She didn't say a word as he entered the room, and they spent the next moment simply staring at each other. He felt a slight bit overdressed standing in front of her. She had since changed back into her baggy shinobi outfit, minus the jacket. The moment was broken when Mikoto bowed her head forward slightly, then stood. Naruto wasn't sure if she was going to walk over to him, but she stopped about halfway between the bed and the door, then dropped down to her knees in front of him and kept her gaze focused on the ground at his feet. Dana-sama, I'm yours from this day forth, wholly and completely. Whatever your wish, you may command me as you see fit. My life. Mikoto's speech was cut off as Naruto had quickly dropped to his knees and pulled his new wife into his arms. Mikoto, why are you saying such strange things all of a sudden? He heard her let out a rush of breath as her chin settled on his shoulder, and she relaxed completely as her arms returned his hug. I'm sorry, she began. My father had me remember the speech back when I first got engaged to Fugaku. It's something of a tradition, or so he claimed, even if he never followed through with mother. In short, it gives the husband ultimate power, even if he was not the one born into a position of leadership. That's stupid, Naruto snorted. Realizing the potential insult, he quickly backpedaled. I don't mean that in a bad way, but it does sound kind of silly too. He was cut off as Mikoto pulled back slightly to look at him as he spoke, then moved forward, pressing her lips against his. He was surprised, but pleasantly so. She didn't linger, however, and pulled back quickly while tossing him a shy smile. "It's okay. I think it's stupid too, but our society has come a long way since the time this was made up. Regardless, even if I was heir, you would have complete control over me. I know Fugaku would have used it. And you hoped I wouldn't," Naruto finished for her. Seeing her nod and hopeful look, he couldn't help but grin and kiss her again. It was about the same duration as the one she had just given him, but now it was her turn to look amused. "I'm glad you placed your hopes in me, because I don't really care about something like that. You know more than I do about this clan business. I think all the elders just agreed with me because I make the clan look good." While Makoto did not respond to his comment, she simply nodded as she pulled out of his hug and rose to her feet. Offering him a hand, which he graciously accepted, she pulled him up and then tugged him towards her as she moved backwards. As a result, they both fell over onto the bed. Naruto shifted slightly to the side so that he would not fall over directly on top of her, even if he didn't think he was that heavy. While they had definitely become much closer over the past several weeks, Naruto was more than happy to let Makoto take charge and move at the pace she felt was appropriate. Taking things slow was fairly new to him as well, and relationships during the war, if you could really even call them that, crashed and burned more often than not because of the hectic times. Physical gratification in some manner almost became a necessity later on, since the slightest amount of depression could get you sucked into the red moon if you weren't careful or powerful enough to resist the pull. Luckily, he wasn't like many of the others. He was fairly powerful already, and with Kurama's chakra also in his system, it worked as the ultimate genjutsu breaker, so he never really had anything to worry about. The closest he would have come to falling was after the death of Tsunade, but Kurama snapped him out of that funk fast enough. Sakura's death had been next, but he had managed to harden himself enough by that point to keep the severe, lingering grief at bay. Naruto? His mind snapping back to the present, Naruto looked down curiously at the woman who was now rolling over on top of him a little and had her forearms propped up against his chest, lifting her torso so she was looking down at him. "Yes? Thank you." Naruto stared curiously at Makoto, waiting a second for her to elaborate, but she didn't. "Huh? I don't think you have to thank me for anything, do you?" he questioned. "Thank you for being you, I mean." Makoto sighed. "I'm amazed you turned out the way you did, considering your past. I'm glad I was able to find someone who was honorable and kind, and the fact that you've managed to stay that way even through a war you were losing is nothing short of amazing." She began to shift her arms, moving them to both sides of his torso as she gradually lowered her chest against his. Her long black hair had started to come loose from the simple bun it was in, and as a result it had started hanging down along her head, framing her face. "When I first knew about having to get married, I never thought I'd get to feel as satisfied as I am now. I always dreamed that I would get someone who, as you put it, cares about me because of who I am, not what I am." Her dark eyes flickered a faint red as the strength of her emotions was causing her Sharingan to activate unconsciously. "I think you've proven more than once that being married to the Uchiha head doesn't really matter to you." Makoto smiled now, her eyes dimming back down to their normal dark brown. Stretching her neck, she placed a light kiss on his chin. "I love you." Naruto couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the first time they had mentioned love. Their first was about a week ago. But it was definitely the most private setting in which it had been mentioned. She was still slightly elevated from him, so he lifted his head to press his lips against hers for a lingering kiss. Finally moving his arms now as well, he rested his hands on the back of her arms and began slowly rubbing them. "I love you too, Makoto," he murmured as he pulled back from the kiss. He was thinking she'd just settle back down and they'd rest and talk after the long day, but she began to grind against him slightly as she shifted her weight up along his body. He watched her, both curious and aroused, as she finally lowered herself to settle next to him so that their eyes met evenly. She kissed him quickly, then moved her head next to his. "I've been waiting for tonight for weeks. I'm not wearing anything under my uniform," she whispered seductively. Nibbling on his earlobe before pulling away, Naruto couldn't remember a time where his arousal had built so steadily and reached such a high point before. He couldn't help but grin as he turned his head and blew air at the back of her neck, causing her to shiver slightly against him. "I guess it wouldn't be polite for me to keep a lady waiting, would it?" "Definitely not," she murmured. "Now get busy, husband." He definitely did not need to be told twice. Omic. And so we needed to come before Hokage-sama for permission since there are only 2 named Uzumaki left in the village. Without a clan leader, Hokage-sama makes any final decisions regarding the fate of the Uzumaki. Wait. Naruto held up his hands, and everyone paused to see what he had to say. You all aren't going to spring some surprise on me, since I'm one of the last Uzumaki, are you? Something about there being a little-known clan restoration act or plan that you want me to participate in and force me to marry multiple women after Makoto, which may include Terumi May and heavens forbid, my sister Kushina. Naruto shuddered. Until we have plenty of children and you are all satisfied the clan won't die out? Taking a deep breath, after speaking so much, he eyed several people in the room warily. Are you? Silence pervaded for a few moments as Hiruzen just stared at Naruto incredulously. Where did you get that idea from? He asked after he finally found his voice. Wait, this isn't something from when? His voice trailed off, but the intention was clear. Hiruzen was asking if it was something they did in the future, likely because of the Uchiha clan being completely decimated. Unfortunately, all Naruto could do was shrug. I don't know, honestly. I mean, I heard rumors, but I don't know how much truth there was to them. Though they say all rumors have some basis in truth. The Hokage leaned forward and rubbed his temples, mumbling for a few moments. Finally he cleared his throat and looked up. Naruto, I swear nothing like that will happen on my watch. It's completely preposterous. Naruto could only nod and then looked around the room to see the other reactions to what he asked. Danzo was giving him some kind of shrewd look, probably thinking of doing exactly what he had said at some point in time. Kagami appeared exasperated, if not a bit peeved, while the other Uchiha elders simply looked to be a mix of confused and agitated. He turned to look at Makoto, but he noticed her turn away the moment she came into his field of vision. Naruto could barely tell from the profile glimpse of her face that it was turning red, and considering the way her fists were clenched and shaking, it probably meant he was in for a world of hurt. He thought he had grown out of that big mouth. Oh well. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. Just under 2 years later. Master? Hey, Master, wait up. Naruto stopped walking, turning to look over his shoulder with a small smile on his face. He'd recognize that loud, boisterous voice anywhere. A young girl who was nearly 8 years old came to a skidding halt next to him as he watched, amused. His smile grew as he noticed a gleaming protector on her forehead with the leaf insignia emblazoned upon it. Before he could say anything, the girl pointed at him and yelled, I did it, Master. Now you owe me a jutsu. You promised me that you'd teach me one after I graduated. Chuckling, Naruto nodded. That I did. I always keep my promises. Walking over, he leaned over and gave the girl a brief hug, which she quickly returned before mumbling about being embarrassed. Sorry, Anko. I didn't mean to embarrass you. Let's go celebrate for a bit. What do you want for lunch? Dango. The shout came as no surprise to Naruto, so he simply nodded and gestured for the purple-haired girl to follow. He was just wandering around the village aimlessly right now anyway as he was waiting for her class to get out. Many of the random people they met in the street would nod and greet Naruto as he walked by with his young apprentice, many even offering her their own congratulations to the girl. He'd never seen that big a smile stay on her face for so long. Almost 2 years ago, the Sandaime had shown him the list of the current academy students, as well as those who would be enrolling soon. The moment his eyes drifted across the name Mitarashi Anko, he had requested to take her as an apprentice on the spot. Of course Hiruzen seemed a bit put out by that, obviously hoping he would have taken a full team. Once Naruto explained about who Anko was in the future and how she had been abandoned by Orochimaru, however, he understood completely. Naruto had no problem taking a full team after his initial training with Anko was finished and she became a genin. But he wanted to give one of his old friends from during the war a better early career where she wouldn't be abandoned like trash and instead be treated with respect for the rest of her tenure as a shinobi. Anko was an orphan, apparently both of her parents were killed during the Second War. She also thought she had an older sibling, but was too young to remember clearly and only heard rumors. She went on a brief search when she was apprenticed to Naruto, but had so far not found anything. Then again, there was only so much a girl her age could do. Naruto was honestly pleased with both Anko and his own teaching skills which had come a long way since Konohamaru. He was able to teach her well enough so that she was able to burn through the academy programs and graduate in 2 years when the full program ran for 6 and up to 8 if you included remedial classes. Now that they were in wartime though, the academy was trying to pump all their students out in a maximum of 4 years. He had managed to make Anko good enough in half that time. Sure, she was no Hataka Kakashi or alternate Itachi, but she was very skilled in her own right for someone so young. He had also been teaching her things that weren't in the academy curriculum, such as tree climbing and water walking, and had also figured out that she had an affinity for water chakra. The only thing he wouldn't do was teach her any proper jutsu other than the academy basics before she graduated. At first she seemed rather put out by that fact, but then when he told her the stronger she was when she graduated, the stronger the techniques he could teach her. She gave it all she had. He didn't want to spoil the girl too much, if anything Mikoto did that enough for him. In fact, his wife would have already adopted the girl if not for the fact that families were not allowed to apprentice their own children. If they wanted her, Naruto wouldn't be allowed to be her master anymore. He offered Anko the option, of course, but the girl was fine being the only Mitarashi. She wanted to keep Naruto as her sensei. That didn't stop her from calling him dad on occasion when they were alone. The first time she did it a scant few months ago, she surprised herself if the look on her face was anything to go by. She quickly slapped her hands over her mouth as she stared at him, blushing red, then quickly began stuttering out how she didn't mean to, apologizing while panicked. When he pulled her into a hug and told her he was flattered, she began to cry, saying she didn't want to upset him because she turned down his previous offer. He told her that she could call him that whenever she wanted to, even if it wasn't official on paper. He was also able to fondly remember the first time she had called Mikoto mom, just to see her reaction. His wife literally melted right in front of their eyes, and he had to pull Anko out of the woman's grasp as she was going to suffocate his apprentice with her own hug. The girl obviously took their reactions to heart, as after a couple months of training she had asked to move out of her lonely village subsidized apartment and into the Uchiha district near them. They were more than happy to oblige. As for the Uchiha clan and the district in general, Mikoto had taken up the mantle of clan head nearly a year ago and had plenty of good ideas, though it went without saying that she often came to her husband for his advice and thoughts on nearly every action. Many Uchiha often joked that the clan had 2 heads, but they worked so well together that no one was complaining about it to the best of their knowledge. In regards to the district itself, it had also been through quite a few changes. One of the first things Naruto had suggested to Mikoto once she was made clan head was that they remove the wall around the compound, or at least most of it. She was skeptical at first, but upon listening to his explanation, she agreed it made sense and went along with it. It was what he called step 1 in his plan, to get the Uchiha more involved with the village as a whole, and to do it in ways that seemed small at first but would gradually change not only the clan but the village as well. The elders and most of the older generations didn't seem to care about the wall one way or another, which they took as a good sign. The rest of the village was surprised but pleased, not to mention that Hiruzen thought it was brilliant. The rumor going around was that the Hyuga, the only other clan with all wall around their compound, were also thinking of tearing theirs down too. Uchiha clan members were now encouraged to live anywhere in the village that they wanted, which made for many happy clan members as some felt suffocated being stuck on Uchiha clan grounds. Not only that, but people from outside of the village were allowed to live and do business on clan grounds if they wished, but they were charged a premium in rent and merchant fees. None of them complained about the premium since they were able to live and do business in what was quickly becoming the most popular and best protected area of the village. Of course, all of Naruto's plans didn't go into effect without some grumbling. Fugaku was more often than not at the forefront, though Naruto was unsure if the man was putting himself out there as Naruto's opposition just because he had a grudge or if he had legitimate issues. They never really talked to each other unless they absolutely had to, so Naruto tended to avoid the military police headquarters unless Mikoto sent him there because she didn't want to deal with him. Fugaku was always too much into the status quo and didn't appear to handle change very well if the grimace constantly on his face was any indication. Minato had joked more than once that Naruto was whipped, and Naruto didn't argue the point. Sure, he might have had to do some things he didn't really want to, but on the other hand he was happier than he could ever remember being before, so he didn't mind doing pretty much anything his wife asked. That wasn't to say he had any major problems with Fugaku, because he didn't. They just didn't really get along at all, and neither of them put any effort into fixing things between them. Fugaku seemed to begrudgingly accept the fact that Naruto was doing quite a lot of good for the clan, even for someone who wasn't an Uchiha by blood. He didn't bother Naruto about things, and in return Naruto was completely hands-off with the military police. He only asked for quarterly reports, which he always got right on time. So long as there were no issues, it would likely stay that way for the foreseeable future. He heard Anko start to chatter excitedly and looked to see what she was making a fuss about. From the looks of things, not only had they arrived, but Minato was there as well with his team, which he had just gotten a little under a year ago. At the same time he got his team, Hiruzen had surprised Minato by telling him that he would be Hokage when the war was over. The four friends had a small party that night in congratulations, but sadly had to end it early because Minato was whining that the Hokage wanted him up early for his new training to start. The full announcement was supposedly going to be made to the village later this month, and from the looks of things they were already getting started on adding his face to the mountain. This of course made the village rumor mill go crazy, many thinking that the next Hokage would be either Hatake Tsukumo or Orochimaru. Naruto's focus shifted from the mountain back over to his apprentice, who had run ahead excitedly, yammering about how she had graduated and showing each member of Minato's team in turn. Chuckling to himself, he grinned at the younger blonde and sat down in an empty chair next to his friend. "I don't think I've ever seen you over here with your team before." Minato shrugged, idly waving around a dango stick he seemed to be nibbling on. Obito wanted to try something different today, and for once Kakashi didn't disagree. "So, here we are. No comments from Rin-chan either?" "Nope. But she's usually agreeable to anything either of them say anyway." Naruto nodded. He hadn't gotten to know the members of Minato's team as well as he would have liked, but since they were consistently out on missions he never really got any opportunities. The few chances he did have also forced him to split his attention between them and Anko, though his apprentice obviously always got priority. He already knew Kakashi through Tsukumo, not to mention the one mission they went on a while ago. Kakashi seemed a lot more open and friendly with his father still alive, though he still had that slightly aloof attitude that easily pissed people off. He didn't know if this Kakashi got along better with Obito or not, and he didn't want to be nosy with someone else's team, but he couldn't help but be curious. In general, Kakashi was simply much more pleasant than he had been expecting, knowing more about the man's past from his now alternate future than anyone else. Some of that may have had to do with the general feeling of hero worship that Kakashi often hit him with. While it wasn't extreme by any means, it wasn't unusual for Kakashi to come to Naruto for advice instead of Minato, or even his father. Tsukumo took it all in stride, but Minato appeared to be rather put out whenever it happened. When Naruto asked Kakashi why he didn't ask others, the only real response he got was that Naruto just so happened to be the strongest person he knew. When questioned about his father or the Hokage, the only response was, "I've never seen them fight." It made sense, though Minato's grumblings would have a habit of getting to Kushina, and then both Naruto and Kakashi would suffer her wrath. It wasn't bad, per se. And nowhere near as bad as what she would do to someone who she was legitimately angry with. Still, she sometimes put a little extra effort into actually trying to hurt him during their frequent training sessions. In regards to Obito, the teen regarded him with complete awe the few times they had met. He assumed it was just because of him being married to the clan head and perhaps even a few tall tales from Kakashi, but apparently that wasn't all. Obito's parents had claimed that bringing Naruto into the clan was a godsend, and they had respect again thanks to him. They were getting along with the rest of the village better than they had since the short reign of the Nidaime Hokage and when he implemented the military police. Obito's parents nearly worshipped him, and as a result, that had sort of passed on to the young boy. Naruto had asked Mikoto if Obito was related to her in any way, but she wasn't aware of him being immediate family. He was only very slightly upset about not having a nephew to spoil. Of course, that didn't stop him from teaching the boy a prank or three. Minato never stopped griping about it though, saying he didn't want his team to have a bad reputation, so Naruto had recently refrained from teaching the boy anything new, but instead had him practicing his stealth so that he could prank but not get caught. Last but not least, there was Rin. She was the quiet one of their team and also filled in the role similar to what Sakura was on his first team. He'd seen her patching up Obito and Kakashi after training and spars, though she never used the mystical palm technique, so he guessed that she didn't know it. As far as he knew, Minato didn't know the technique either. However, he knew in his time she had done Kakashi's eye transplant, so if she did know it now she just chose not to use it for some reason. Rin must have noticed him looking at her because she immediately looked away and blushed, a small smile on her face. Naruto couldn't help but chuckle a little. From the moment they met she seemed to have developed a small crush on him. When he tried talking to the girl she always had a hard time looking him in the eye when she responded, not to mention the blush that always began working over her cheeks. Of course it may also have been some sort of hero worship, considering who her other two teammates were. Of course there was also the fact that between looks, skill, and general demeanor, it was no secret that women stared at both him and Minato whenever they were together in the village. It was cute listening to Kushina and Makoto growl about it, while conveniently forgetting that they often were stared at as well by the men. "Any idea when you're going to start doing missions with her?" he heard Minato's voice ask. It only took a second for Naruto's mind to catch on. "Not anytime really soon. Hokage-sama was saying he doesn't want me going out without a full team. He's probably going to give me 2 more kids to work with before he gives us anything." He saw Minato nod out of the corner of his eye. "Makes sense. You're a good teacher, I don't think he'd want you to only have 1 student. I don't really care one way or the other. I'm happy with the one I have. If I get more, I'll adjust." When Naruto finished talking, one of the waitresses came over and took his order. Anko noticed this and rather loudly offered her opinion on what to get, and with a chuckle he decided to get it for them. As Anko went back to start chatting with the other team, Naruto took a moment to look around. It was a rather busy afternoon, though he believed part of that had to do with the academy's graduation. People were bustling about all over the place, even though the little dango shop they were at wasn't really on any of the main roads in the village, it was still rather busy. He always imagined villages to be rather quiet during wartime, but Konoha actually seemed to be busier than before. A lot of that may have had to do with the previous arrivals from 2 years ago, but even after they settled in the village continued growing. Konoha's current size and relative power, when compared to the other hidden villages, was likely the reason that none had officially declared war on them yet, even though Konoha had been running plenty of interference for their allies, especially in grass, waterfall, and rain. Without warning, one of the village Anbu dropped down into his field of vision and moved forward swiftly. All of the shinobi present stopped talking and turned to stare, likely to see if they would be the one called. But the way the Anbu was purposefully striding towards him led Naruto to believe that he was the current target. Everyone else started turning back to their business when they realized this as well. Sure enough, once the Anbu was close enough, he stopped a few steps away and gave a swift bow. "Uchiha-sama, Hokage-sama requests your presence as soon as possible." Naruto nodded slowly. "Any idea what it's about?" "No, he just asked me to deliver the message." "Thank you." Dismissed. The Anbu immediately disappeared in a swirl of leaves. "Any idea what he wants you for?" Minato's question caused Naruto to look at the other blonde as he stood up. "Since Anko graduated." Naruto shrugged, "Probably something about a team, so he can send me on missions, I'd bet." "Well, let me know when you find out, if you can." "Of course," Naruto grinned. Reaching into one of the pockets of his vest, he pulled some money out and handed it to Minato. The other blonde nodded, knowing that it was to pay for the food that he had ordered but wouldn't get to eat. Honestly, he wasn't that hungry, so it was more for Anko than him. His eyes sought out the youngest member among their group, only to see her with a questioning expression on her face. Smiling briefly as he walked over to where she was sitting, he gently poked the side of her arm. "You can stay and eat with Team Minato. Don't cause them any trouble, alright?" Anko answered by giving him a big smile and a "yeah, good. If you have anything left over and your friends don't want any, just take what's left over back home and Makoto will show you where to put it." Once he got another firm nod, he chuckled before looking at Obito. The other Uchiha looked startled at first to be stared at by one of the clan heads but quickly tried to cover it with a neutral expression that Naruto was getting used to seeing. Naruto placed his hand on top of Obito's head and rubbed it for a second since the kid had goggles around his neck for some reason. Just like he expected, Obito immediately scowled and tried to fix it, even though his hair was usually a mess anyway. "I'm placing Anko under your care, got it?" Naruto stated in mock seriousness. Obito simply gaped for a second before nodding slowly. "Hey, are you sure? If I wasn't, I wouldn't have asked. Keep her out of trouble, but if she doesn't behave let me know later and I'll straighten her out." He tossed a wink to the boy and was mildly surprised to see the look of acceptance and determination pass across Obito's face. He ignored the "wine dad" that came from Anko, but shared a nod with Minato before waving to everyone else and disappearing in a swirl of leaves. Hokage office. Ah, Naruto. I've heard Anko passed the exam at the top of the current batch of graduates. Congratulations for a job well done. Naruto smiled internally at the praise, but on the outside he tried to keep the smile as nothing more than a twitch on his lips. Thank you, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen shuffled about with some things on his desk, grabbing 2 folders and holding them out for Naruto to take a look at. Moving forward to take the folders, he examined the covers to see a name written on the one on top. It was a name that he recognized faintly but wasn't very familiar with, even during the war. Those 2 may be of interest to you. Considering what you've done with little Anko, I feel you would be the best instructor for these 2 as well. You told me you wouldn't be opposed to taking on a team after Anko graduated, and well. The Hokage leaned back in his chair as his voice trailed off, and Naruto shot him a mock glare. I didn't mean the same day she graduated, old man. Hiruzen merely shrugged, offering the blonde a shrewd smile. Semantics. Snorting as he shook his head, Naruto opened the file on top, only to see the face of a serious-looking young girl. Her hair was dark near the top of her head and was kept at about shoulder length, turning into a lighter violet near the ends. Yuzuki Yugao was not a name he heard often back in his time. About the most that he knew was that she was once an Anbu under Kakashi and had a boyfriend who was killed when Sand and Sound villages invaded them during the Chunin exams. He didn't know where she was during the war and could only guess that she was killed as he didn't remember hearing of her about her at any time other than when Kakashi would tell stories about old missions he had been on. Apparently she had also just graduated this time around and was ranked 6th in her class. Her focus was almost entirely on offense, and according to teachers' notes, she seemed to have taken a liking to using a sword. However, it seemed that this desire of hers only appeared within the last few months, so she was still a complete novice. Otherwise, she was perfectly competent in all other shinobi aspects. Closing her file, he tossed it into the chair next to him, then opened the other one. This recent graduate was a complete unknown for him, though the last name did ring a few bells. One was because of the name of the Bijuu that had been sealed into him for years, and another because it was the clan name of a group of experienced genjutsu users that lived in the village. When he was younger, he had to help the current heiress, Kurama Yakumo, overcome her own nightmares. This boy was Kurama Takuya, and he had already shown promise when using genjutsu. He was a little underwhelming with other, more physical aspects of being a shinobi, but that was understandable considering where his focus lay. Apparently the boy also had near-perfect chakra control, which would make him a good healer should he be willing to pick up a few things. Other than that, everything else seemed rather average. His graduation ranking was even in the middle of his class, at 14. So you want me to take these 2 on, Hokage-sama? Yes. I was checking over Anko's graduation file and noticed that she very nearly excels at every category except chakra control. She would be the perfect balance between the other 2 selected there. Yugao has been focusing on more offensive aspects, while Takuya is more of a defensive type. Naruto let out a sigh before nodding and grabbing the file he had tossed on the chair. Placing them together, he handed them back to the Hokage. If you think it's a good idea, then I'll do it. When do I need to get them? Accepting the files, Hiruzen chuckled. Later this afternoon, around 3. The graduates were told to gather again after being dismissed this morning to get their congratulations from family and peers. I'll be having a brief meeting with the other Jonin sensei shortly. Enough time for me to warn my wife and apprentice I'll be getting a team, then take a nap. I like it. Hiruzen snorted, then began to chuckle. Whatever you want. You've got a little over an hour. Don't make your students wait too long. Naruto grinned as he reviewed his own memories of having to wait nearly 2 hours for Kakashi to appear on their first day as a team. Mikoto would kill him if he was ever that late to anything. No wonder Kakashi always remained single. Bidding the Hokage farewell, he quickly made his way home to relay the news to his wife. After that, he'd take his nap, because if his old team was any indication, it could be a very long day. Classroom Academy. Yugao. Yugao. Are you excited? The purple-haired girl turned her head to look at her good friend, Maki. Of course I am. Maki frowned. You don't really look like you are. Are you daydreaming about your crush again? Shut up. I am not. Aha. I think that just gave it away. You're so cute when you blush. Yu Gao groaned, trying to hide her face as she turned away. She knew she shouldn't have said anything about her recent interest to any of her friends. She didn't even know his name and only saw that he was really good with a sword. It was amazing to watch him dance around with his weapon, fighting invisible enemies. It looked so graceful, and she wanted to be able to do the same thing. As a result, she made the decision to pick up the use of the sword over the last 3 months of her academy education. There wasn't really anyone at the school willing to teach her yet, so she had been trying to teach herself through books and from observing others using weapons. She only hoped now that she got a teacher who could teach her a few things, or at least point her in the direction of someone who could. While Maki apparently decided to let go of any comments about Yu Gao's latest crush, that didn't stop her from asking anything else. "So, who do you think they're going to team you with? I hope I get put with Ryu. I hear he was second place in the class. Not only that, he's dreamy too." Yu Gao tossed a wry look at her friend, but Maki was too busy staring and sighing at a boy sitting a few rows in front of them who was talking animatedly to 2 of his friends. While, yes, he was smart and rather good-looking too, she came from a family with a long history of shinobi service. If she was going after boys instead of concentrating on her studies, her family would be rather disappointed. Of course, that didn't stop her from admiring her newest crush. The fact that he was so good with a sword was a bonus. Any other thoughts or comments from Maki were cut off as their Chunin instructor entered the room, quieting them down. As everyone moved back to their seats, he began speaking. "First, let me offer everyone in this room a heartfelt congratulations. You've all passed the graduation exam as well as the accelerated courses and made me very proud. You're done here for now, though keep in mind some teachers may have their own tests to make sure you can all cut it on the field and not just in the classroom. The climate out there in the world is currently open warfare, though our village has not gotten completely involved yet. Your various senseis will want you to be able to operate as complete units. With that said, all of the team leaders are currently waiting outside the store. Be ready to work hard because there is a lot to do in preparation for things to come. With that, His words were cut off as the door to the classroom slid open and a young girl with hair nearly the same color as her own entered the room and promptly closed the door again behind her. She gave everyone a big smile before looking at the instructor. "Sorry to interrupt, but my sensei said I should come and wait in here for when the rest of my team is announced." Yu Gao watched on as her instructor chuckled and pointed at one of the empty seats near the front. "Sure thing, Anko-san. Have a seat right there in the front." It didn't take long for whispered conversations to start at that, and Yu Gao found herself getting a bit excited too. There were rumors in the beginning that she was being trained by a big shot jonin, but it was all very hush-hush. For 2 years she'd heard rumors, not to mention that no one really saw much of Anko at all anymore. Then, just the other day, she had entered into the graduation exam with Yu Gao and the rest of her class. Most were shocked, and nearly everyone expected her to fail right away. Much to everyone's surprise. Including the teachers. She had gone ahead and graduated right at the top of the class. Yu Gao thought it was amazing that Anko could accomplish that feat even after having never spent a single day in school and only being trained by her master. After the test was concluded, Mitarashi Anko was more than happy to tell everyone she was the apprentice for the one and only Uchiha Naruto. As a result, virtually everyone agreed that it wouldn't have been such a surprise that she passed the test if they had known. If for some reason a person didn't know who Anko was, they definitely knew who Naruto was. The man wasn't called the right hand of the Hokage for no reason. Yu Gao. Maki elbowed her in the side, quickly grabbing her attention. "I still want to be on Ryu's team. But, I want to be on Anko-san's team." Could you imagine being taught by Uchiha-sama? All Yu Gao could do was nod. Of course she'd want to have Uchiha-sama as a teacher. But he would probably take one of the most well-rounded teams, and since she only placed highly, but not at the top, it was unlikely that she would be put there. Still, she could dream. She was about to respond to her friend, but the instructor began announcing teams, so she remained silent. Team 1 is the following: Tamagashi Ryu, Mitakato Juuchi, and Hanataba Maki. Maki's squeal was sharp, but immediately silenced as the girl slapped her hand over her mouth. Everyone in the class was looking at her, and she slumped down in her chair as her face turned bright red. Clearing his throat, the instructor shook his head as he continued, "Your Jonin sensei is Yugana Mio. Team 2 is still in rotation from last graduation, so Team 3 will be." Yu Gao kept one ear on what the instructor was saying in case she heard her name, but otherwise turned to look at Maki, who was slowly sitting back up and trying to ignore anyone still looking at her. "Well, at least you got one of the things you wanted, right?" Yugao whispered. Maki looked at her friend and smiled briefly, but then her eyes shifted to looking back down the road to where Ryu was sitting. He must have been looking up at her, because Maki's eyes went wide and she immediately looked back down into her lap. Yugao struggled to keep from laughing, but somehow she managed. Shifting her full attention back to the front of the classroom, she tuned back in just as the instructor was finishing announcing Team 5. 6 was apparently still in rotation as well, so next up was Team 7. Team 7 will be Kurama Takuya, Yuzuki Yugao, and Mitarashi Anko. Your Jonin-sensei will be Uchiha Naruto. Yugao felt her heart stop. She would be having the Uchiha Naruto as her Jonin-sensei? This was like a dream come true, but she didn't think that she really deserved to be placed on a team under him. Sure, she was one of the top of the class, but she didn't really stand out in any areas. Not only that, but she didn't know if he'd want to keep her if she insisted on using a sword, which she really wanted to do. Yugao. Congratulations. A furious whisper in her ear brought her thoughts back into focus as she turned to look at Maki, who was giving her a huge smile. Who would have thought you'd be on his team? When Yugao didn't respond and instead stared straight ahead, Maki chuckled and continued listening to the rest of the teams being announced. Meanwhile, Yugao's eyes had sought out Anko and was wondering why the girl was looking back at her with a big grin on her face. The only legitimate reason she could think of was that Anko already knew who was on her team and what they looked like. However, as the instructor finished announcing the teams and congratulated them all once again, she found herself quickly not caring as the first Jonin-sensei entered the room and Maki waved goodbye. She was going to be on Uchiha Naruto-sama's team. Even if he didn't want to keep her for whatever reason, she'd learn everything she could as fast as he was willing to teach. Some time later, Naruto grinned as he walked behind his new team. They were on their way to Training Ground 7, otherwise still known as his home away from home. Most of the time each team was assigned their own individual ground that matched their team number, but occasionally some teams had to share. For whatever reason, Team 7 was only allocated to what were considered special cases, and that included one of the largest training grounds. Hirazen's old team was Team 7, as was Jiraiya's. Strangely, Minato was on Team 5, but Kushina was on Team 7. After Kushina's team graduated, there had been no further Team 7 until now. It had been a few years. For some reason he could have sworn that Kakashi was on Team 7 in his time, but they were instead Team 6 that was still in rotation from the last graduation. He watched as Anko chattered away at Yugao, who at least appeared to be giving the slightly younger girl her full attention. Takuya was a step or two behind the girls, apparently listening in as well but not commenting. Other than telling his new team to head for the training ground, he hadn't said a word. He'd noticed Yugao sneak him plenty of glances, and even Takuya had glanced at him a few times, but neither of them had said another word or tried to approach him in any way. He had a number of guesses as to why, but for the moment simply chalked it up to them being incredibly nervous around him. Thankfully Anko was as talkative as she was, otherwise the silence may have made things even more awkward than they already were. Upon arrival at the training area, Anko hopped over and sat down in the middle of a small clearing. It was her usual spot when she was here training with him. She beckoned them over, but both of his other charges glanced back at Naruto to see if they should. Go ahead and have a seat, Naruto smiled at them both. We'll go ahead and get started with introductions and then move on to what we need to accomplish as a team. Yugao and Takuya immediately moved to sit down next to Anko, one on either side. I guess since I'm your team leader and trainer, I'll get started. My name is Uchiha Naruto. I like ramen, my wife, my clan, Anko, my friends, and the village. My immediate goal is to make you three the best team to ever come out of Konoha. My dream is to bring peace to the shinobi world, retire, and have lots of grandkids. Yugao and Takuya were just staring at him, wide-eyed, while Anko was simply looking at him with a small smile. Not surprising since Anko already knew all of that, but he'd have to bring Yugao and Takuya back down to earth and not place him on some kind of pedestal. Respect was fine, but he didn't need worship. Anko, why don't you go next? Okay. Anko chirped. My name is Mitarashi Anko. I like Dango, my mom and dad, Minato-sensei and his team, and Kushina Onisan. My goal is to be a Chunin before I'm 10. My dream is to be known all over the world as one of the strongest kunoichi ever. She grinned, looking back and forth between her two new teammates. Takuya looked slightly amused, while Yugao was appraising the other girl with a critical eye. Before anyone else could say a word, Naruto pointed at the Kurama boy. "Okay, Takuya. You next." The boy looked at everyone one time before nodding his head. "My name is Kurama Takuya of the Kurama clan. I like Genjutsu, my brother and uncle, and helping and healing people that need it. My immediate goal." Takuya's voice drifted for a moment and he looked up into the trees for a moment. "Is to master my clan's Genjutsu techniques. My dream is to get the clan to focus on more than just Genjutsu, so we aren't looked down upon by other clans in the village." Naruto hummed thoughtfully. Being honest, other than Yakumo, he didn't really know anyone from the clan well. Heck, he didn't really ever get to know Yakumo well either. After he had helped her get the Ido under control, the Kurama clan appreciated what he did, but they didn't exactly want him hanging around. He didn't understand it then, but now that he was older and thought about it, perhaps he wasn't the kind of permanent influence they wanted around the girl. He knew well just from being married to Makoto that clan politics dictated a lot about the ways clans operated, and he wasn't exactly someone noteworthy then. They probably didn't want Yakumo gaining any further interest in him. Nodding at Takuya, he moved his attention to Yugao, who squirmed a little and wouldn't look him in the eye. "Your turn, Yugao." "Eyes. My name is Yuzuki Yugao. We're not a clan, but my family has a long decorated history of serving as shinobi even before Konoha existed, and I am of the 6th generation. I like training, spending time with family, and swords. My goal is to become a master in Kenjutsu. My dream is to be a respected member of Anbu so I can protect my home and to have a family someday. Excellent goals and dreams, all of you. For our first order of business, I will tell you all that there will be no further testing. We are officially Team 7 right now. Understood?" Anko simply grinned, while Yugao looked stunned. Takuya, however, slowly raised a hand. "You don't need to treat this like a classroom, Takuya-kun. Just ask." "Oh, okay. Are you sure we don't need to be tested?" Our instructor made it sound like all the teams would be tested again. "They can be, sure," Naruto shrugged. "But it's our prerogative as Jonin-sensei. I've already been training Anko for the past couple years, so I know what she's capable of. Neither of you realize it, but the Hokage picked both of you specifically to be placed on my team. I have faith that none of you will let me down. Will you?" All three of them immediately shook their heads negatively. "Good. Then that's all I need. I will train you all into the ground, but you'll be better off for it. One thing I want to tell you all is that you can relax around me. Yes, I'm the husband of the Uchiha clan leader and have fought Biju and Jinchuriki and lived to tell the tale, among other things. But I'm still Naruto. So there will be none of that Uchiha-sama stuff when you're around me. It's either Naruto or Naruto-sensei. Understood?" The three of them immediately agreed vocally, two of them calling him sensei, while the third called him father. Needless to say, the other two couldn't help but stare at Anko, who was grinning cheekily. Naruto simply gave her a deadpan stare. "What dear Anko means is that I've tried to adopt her in the past, but because of clan laws being what they are, I cannot apprentice someone in my own clan. So she kept her name, though we still have something of a strange father-daughter relationship. That does not mean, however, that she will be getting any special treatment from me." "Oh, you're no fun." Anko stuck her tongue out at Naruto, only for him to sigh and rub his forehead. "Anyway, all of you can take the rest of the day off. Get some good rest, because training starts in full force tomorrow. I'll be talking with all three of you to see what you'd like to specialize in, and we'll go from there. Any questions?" When there were none, he simply nodded and dismissed them. It didn't take long for the three to leave. Smiling as he watched them go, once the last one was out of sight he turned his head towards one of the trees nearby. "Going to sit up there all day, are you?" There was a faint laugh followed by the rustling of branches, and then Kushina appeared at the bottom of the tree trunk. She had her long hair done up in some incredible braids. It made him wonder just who had the patience to do that. "No fair, Aniki. No matter how hard I try to hide myself and Kyuubi, you can always find me." Naruto grinned at her and let out a chuckle. "Let's just say that I cheat when I find you. Your presence is like a beacon to me." Kushina stopped walking towards him and began to look at him curiously. Naruto knew that comment caught her off guard, if only because it had been a while since he had mentioned anything about it. "Is this about my special chakras again?" Naruto had been training quite a lot with his sister, especially over the course of the last year. While she had been participating in plenty of missions, as a Jinchuriki they didn't want her wandering too far from Konoha proper, and Kushina knew this as well. Therefore her opportunities to take anything above C rank were very few and far between. While Minato was busy with training to be Hokage and Mikoto was working with the Uchiha clan, Naruto took Kushina aside to get her up to speed, combat-wise. She was a brawl fighter, much like he used to be, though she was able to work her chakra chains into her techniques. With some experimentation Naruto found that he was able to use the chains as well, though he needed to use more concentration than he was willing to spare in order to get them to work. It was one of the things that probably made Kushina's chakra special. Even if she wasn't the best at controlling it, hers seemed to be incredibly versatile, and she didn't really need to concentrate at all. She just thought about them, and they did what she wanted. Needless to say, she believed only someone with Uzumaki chakra could even make the chains and not be completely exhausted, so if she had ever had any doubts about him not being of Uzumaki blood, it was immediately eliminated. Naruto wasn't entirely certain how much truth there was to that, but since he didn't have any factual evidence to the contrary, he let it be. When she had seen how quickly he managed to train Anko, she had requested that he train her a little as well when he had time. Naruto was more than happy to oblige, as he was approaching the time that he was going to tell her about Kurama. In order for her to get along with and use Kurama's chakra without hurting herself, though, she needed to have a certain mindset. He was doing his best through training to prepare her, especially to be open-minded. If she went off on Kurama when they were to be officially introduced, the Biju might not work with her on principle. They had been partners for years, but he couldn't speak for the oversized fox, and it would likely be at least somewhat grumpy from being locked away so long. Even though they both agreed it was highly likely that would be the case. Having worked with Kushina for a little over a year now, he was confident in her abilities as a kunoichi, especially when it came to Tai and ninjutsu. Her fuinjutsu was leagues above his, though she promised to help teach him in exchange for everything he had been helping her with. In the last 2 months she had followed up on that promise and began tutoring him in the esoteric ninja art. She had also mellowed out quite a bit from the rambunctious teen she used to be. That wasn't to say she no longer had wild moments, because she certainly did. But she was much more calm in general and looked at life a little more seriously. Mikoto and Minato both agreed with him, and after further discussion with his wife and Hiruzen, they agreed it was time for Kushina to know about Naruto's alternate future and be trained as a Jinchuriki. Sighing out loud, the blonde pushed a hand back through his short, spiky hair. "It's actually good that you came to spy on my new team, because I need to talk to you about a couple things that are going to sound pretty crazy. All I can do is ask that you give me time to explain, and I'll answer all your questions. I can also promise that what I have to say and do will not hurt me, you, or anyone else in Konoha that we care about. Okay?" Kushina's expression went from curious to wary, and her posture shifted to the defensive, but was otherwise standing her ground. After staring at him seriously for a moment, she slowly nodded her head. "What is it?" Taking a deep breath, Naruto made sure to look directly into her dark blue eyes. "I need to talk to the Kyuubi." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. It's about time you showed up, Naruto. Do you know how uncomfortable it is being held like this? I know you needed to take your time for obvious reasons, but it was starting to get ridiculous. Naruto winced as he looked at Kurama's condition. The fox was being held up against a huge earthen-looking sphere. Large stakes had been driven through each of his 4 extremities, all of his tails, and a large one right through the middle of his gut. If that wasn't enough, to add insult to injury, he was also being held down by Kushina's chakra chains. The blonde turned to his future mother, only to see her staring at him, open-mouthed. Naruto simply stared back, nonplussed. "What?" Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she pointed at him and exclaimed, "The fox knows you." "How? Why did this never get talked about all those times before when we were training? You mean you still haven't told her anything yet? Idiot." Naruto shot Kurama a small glare. "You know I couldn't. We talked about it before. Besides, it's not like you said anything either. Can you see anything from here at all?" "No. It's too muffled unless Kushina decides to visit me for some reason. But since she has no reason to other than to check the seal, I don't see her much. It's not like we ever really talked either. You know my history." Holding back a sigh, Naruto instead frowned slightly before nodding at the fox Biju. Turning back to the red head, the frown was quickly replaced by a smile at the utterly flabbergasted expression on her face. She focused on him when she saw him point at the fox. "Do you think you can let the poor guy down? That looks uncomfortable." "Damn right it is. Nothing like getting an itch and not being able to scratch it. Not to mention a constant stomachache." Kushina looked too stunned to be able to say anything coherent, though her expression eventually evened out as she sighed. Rubbing her forehead, she simply looked back and forth between the fox and the person she looked towards as an older brother. "This is a dream, right? It's all a dream, and I'm going to wake up any minute." Naruto couldn't stop the chuckle that escaped his lips. "I'm afraid not. There's a bunch of things I need to tell you, but first. Don't make me get down on my knees and beg you to let Kurama down." "Why do you want?" Wait. Kurama?" "Yeah." Naruto jerked his thumb back over his shoulder in the fox's direction. "That's the fuzzball's name after all." "Hey. I'm not a fuzzball, brat. I swear, when I get down from here." The fox let out a decent growl, but it amused Naruto far more than it scared him. Even if Kushina was willing to let the Biju down, it appeared as though she was quickly deciding to keep him chained up. Realizing he had to do something about it, the blonde thought of something that he believed would make Kurama seem a little less imposing. Leaning forward conspiratorially, Naruto cupped one of his hands and held it against the side of his mouth, whispering loudly, "So he says. I just think he's a big fuzzball that likes to be rubbed behind the ears, but you didn't hear that from me." His whisper, if one could call it that, wasn't quiet in the least, and Kurama's enhanced hearing could easily pick it up. The Biju continued with his low growl, but didn't say anything. Kushina, on the other hand, was now staring at the fox with something resembling awe. "Pet? Behind the ears, you say?" Naruto nodded slowly as he leaned back and away, looking like the cat who got the canary. "Uh-huh. If you get the right spot, sometimes his back leg does this little kicking thing." Kurama stopped growling and quickly looked away, scowling but obviously embarrassed. At almost the exact same time, Kushina let out a squeal, then immediately removed the chakra chains without another thought. Lifting up her shirt so that her midriff was exposed, she made a twisting motion in front of her abdomen. Naruto observed as the seal darkened and the swirl in the center extended, stretching out beyond the boundary line of the original seal. Before it got too far, however, a fancy script appeared around the outside of the old seal line, stopping the swirl before it expanded too far. Naruto turned to look up at the Biju and watched as the stakes disappeared one by one. The earthen ball behind Kurama began to crumble, and then both it and the Biju fell to whatever invisible surface it was that they were standing on. As Naruto moved over to greet his old friend who began to stretch, he beckoned for Kushina to follow him. She did quickly fall into step behind him, though she still kept her distance. Once he got close enough, he held up his fist at Kurama, who had finished stretching, and settled to look down at the blonde. "Yo. Sorry it took me so long to get here. I've tried to get as much done as I could before I came to get you, since I knew that once I did that things would begin to change drastically." Kurama smirked, then moved his large fist to bump against Naruto's, symbolizing their friendship after years of working together. "Well, you weren't an idiot for once and actually followed the plan, so I can't complain too much." Chuckling and shrugging off the barb, Naruto looked over at Kushina, who was pretty much just looking between the two of them in amazement. Waving his hand in the direction of the fox with a great flourish, he said, "Kushina-chan, allow me to introduce you properly to my best friend and partner, Kurama. Also sometimes known as his demon lordship, the nine-tailed demon fox, Fuzzball, and Oof." Kurama lightly flicked him in the back with a fingernail, sending him sprawling a few feet. "What have I said about calling me Fuzzball, birdbrain?" Naruto climbed back to his feet, dusting the imaginary dirt off his pants as he scowled up at the Biju. "Hey. I'm not a birdbrain." "Oh yeah? Well, what about that time when?" Kurama's voice trailed off as Kushina bent forward, holding her stomach as she let out peals of laughter. Both Kurama and Naruto looked at each other and grinned. It seemed the first part of their plan to get her to open up had passed. Still, Naruto couldn't help but feel a bit nervous about what was to come. It was strangely easier with Makoto, if only because they had no previous interaction, so anything that happened would just happen. His relationship with Kushina was much different though, and he didn't want to strain anything between them. Unfortunately, since he took so long to tell her anything about where he came from, it just might. Taking a deep breath, Naruto decided to begin his tale. If he managed to get away in one piece if she came after him, he'd consider himself lucky. Maybe Kurama would be able to save him. Maybe. So let me get this straight. You're from some sort of alternate universe future, where I was your mother, Minato was your father, Rin and Obito were dead, Kakashi was a tardy pervert, and you only ever met Makoto once, but were rivals with and eventually ended up killing her son Sasuke. After 16 years you and Kurama made up when the Fourth War started and had been fighting it for a few more years before using an old seal from Yuzoshiogakure that sent you back in time. The two of them were slowly walking around one of the deserted training areas. Naruto had some clones make sure of that. Talking quietly. Naruto nodded slowly, as that was a fairly decent summary over what he had explained in her mindscape. They probably spent about 4 or 5 hours talking in the seal, and luckily since their brains worked so much faster than if they were conversing in the real world, to anyone who happened upon them, it would have only looked like they were meditating for about 15 minutes. Now that they were out, she wanted a quick recap just to make sure that she didn't dream the whole thing. That about sums it up, yeah. Kushina snorted, it sounds ridiculous. If it wasn't for Kurama agreeing with everything, I don't think I'd believe you. Even having Kurama willing to talk to me after all this time is really weird, but I gave to admit to having known about some pretty crazy things. This is definitely at the top now, though. Naruto wasn't surprised. He likely wouldn't have believed himself either. Hell, eventually it took him dragging Makoto to the Hokage to get her to finally believe that everything he told her was the truth. She had believed him at first, or so he thought, but over the course of several weeks he began to realize that she likely had a hard time believing every word he said about where he was from. Luckily for him, a visit to Hiruzen was all he needed. Hopefully he wouldn't need another for Kushina. Minato would be next, but he had a feeling Minato already knew more, or at least believed he knew more than he let on. So, Naruto. Kushina stopped walking and brought her fingertips up, pressing them together in a timid gesture. Is it strange for you to look at me and not call me your mother? The blonde's head shifted to the side a bit when he noticed she was no longer next to him. Her posture was very closed off at the moment, and it reminded him strongly of the Hinata of his time. She was still looking straight ahead, but he could tell that her face had a slightly reddish tint to it. At first, yeah, he chuckled. But it didn't last very long. I had only met you very briefly from within my own seal that contained Kurama. I never really knew you from where I come from. But when I got here, I sort of settled into the role of your big brother. It was comfortable, and I could still be close to you without having to worry about messing things up with the timeline. A short laugh from Kushina cut him off. When he turned to look at her, she shook her head and looked away, trying to hide her face. What is it? Nothing? Really? She turned to favor him with a shy smile before looking away again. It's funny to think about it now, but after Makoto ni and I heard you talking about us to Iro Senin from the hot springs, I started to crush on you a little bit. Of course it was a bit weird because I still loved Minato at the same time, but I was also really interested in you. Not quite sure what to say to that, Naruto simply settled for scratching at the back of his head and grinning. I'm flattered, but it wouldn't have worked out. He listened to her laugh and watched her nod in response. After that, silence settled between them for several moments before she spoke again in a somewhat halting tone. Naruto. Is it still okay if I call you Aniki? The blonde was quick to nod. Of course. Besides, when you and Minato have kids, I want to be the uncle that gets to spoil them. When Kushina didn't immediately respond, he was going to ask if something was wrong, but she turned her body in his direction and moved forward quickly, grabbing him into a tight hug. Naruto was surprised at first and eventually came to his senses when he felt her hands clutch at the back of his shinobi vest, hugging him tighter. He eventually returned the hug. Kushina-chan? Thank you, Naruto Aniki. Thank you. Oh, of course. They remained like that for a few moments, simply holding each other. Naruto looked around where they were. It was a rather picturesque scene. A few fluffy clouds in the bright blue sky, plenty of green grass below them with trees scattered about here and there. A small stream that acted as a tributary to the Naka River wasn't too far away either. He could hear the faint noise of moving water from where they were. So what should I do now? Naruto was curious as to what she was referring to. Kushina released a hug and backed away a step, wiping at her eyes. I mean, am I the only one that knows this other than Hokage-sama? Of course Hokage-sama knows all this, right? Yes. He was one of the first to know. There are 7 others that know. Maybe 8, though I've only told 5. Can you tell me who? Kushina stopped rubbing at her eyes to stare up at him, obviously eager to find out if it was anyone she knew. Sure. Other than Hokage-sama, there is Shimura Danzo, Hataka Sakumo, Yamanaki Inoichi, Mitakato Hamura, Utatane Kaheru, and Mikoto. Inoichi-kun? Really? Naruto tapped his temple with a finger. When I arrived here, he was the one I trusted most from my time to walk my mind. I wanted to extend that trust to now, because I know the type of man he will become. Kushina nodded, tapping at her chin as she looked away. Mikoto ni also knows? I know I shouldn't be surprised, but I am. She hasn't said a word to me about it. Well, she is my wife, and I didn't want her to marry me and not know who I really am. I think her father also knows some things, but I don't know how much Mikoto and Hokage-sama have told him. I haven't told him anything though, and he hasn't asked either. He just seems to know things. As for not telling you anything, you're the one who does all the talking. Sticking her tongue out at him for his last comment, Kushina gave another nod but didn't say anything further. Silence settled between them once again until an idea popped into Naruto's head. Hey, I was thinking that it may be possible to change our Jinchuriki seals a bit to allow Kurama's consciousness to travel between us. What? How? I still have at least some of Kurama's chakra inside of me. Naruto rubbed his stomach unconsciously, though I haven't used any of it, obviously. I didn't need people to start asking questions, even though it looks like you've wanted to ask from time to time. I'm pretty sure my control has slipped, and you felt it. Naruto grinned a little as Kushina gave him a knowing look and a small nod. I didn't really think too much about it before, but now that you mention it. Yes. Naruto grinned. Anyway, I don't know if the Biju chakra I have will regenerate without him actually being in my seal. I was thinking of using something similar to Minato's Hiraishin that would allow Kurama to travel back and forth between us. If I can do that, if Toby ever comes for you then Kurama can just move over to me and there won't be anything to remove from you. He'll just be confused as hell. Having heard the horrid story of her death, Kushina immediately brightened. You think that will work? Well, I don't know for sure since I've never heard about anything like that being done before, but it's better than nothing, right? Kushina thought about it for another moment before finally agreeing. You're right. It's been a while since I've bothered doing any Fuinjutsu research, and it beats simply training to beat someone that I may never have to fight if we can get it to work. I promise that no child of mine will be without a parent. She was staring at him so seriously when she said that, he couldn't help but let out a sigh and immediately relax. Thank you. Frowning at him for a moment, Kushina asked, the way you sighed, was that your objective all along? A part of it. I don't want you, or Minato, or Mikoto to die, obviously. But there may come a time or two that I need to borrow Kurama for a mission or to take care of someone or something before it becomes a problem, you know. Assuming we get the transfer to work, I mean. Thinking about it for a moment, the Redeed crossed her arms over her chest as she stared at the blonde with a piercing gaze. Knowing what responsibilities he had as a Jinchuriki, he knew Kushina had the same ones on her. The thought of transferring the Biju to another, even if it was just temporary. Naruto would have immediately shot it down in his time. The only reason Kushina likely hadn't immediately done the same was because of both who he was and who he claimed to be. I'm okay with it, on one condition. One of Naruto's eyebrows raised slightly, which is, teach me to use Kurama's chakra. Even though that caught him by surprise, he managed to keep his face even. If you think back, I've already been trying to train you in a way to prepare to use it. I have no problem training you more, and I'm sure Kurama will be more than happy to stretch his legs again. However, there is a condition to your condition. You'll need to befriend Kurama on your own and prove yourself to him before he'll consent to working with you. So how do I do that? Naruto shrugged. Start by talking to him and getting to know him. That's what I did, and he's pretty much one of my best friends now. As soon as he finished talking, Kushina dropped down to the ground and sat with her legs crossed, taking up a meditative pose. Alright, I'm gonna get started then. Don't take things too fast, or he'll just get annoyed. Get to know him normally, because he's just gonna ignore you if you try too hard. Kushina went to reply, but before she could say anything she froze and her eyes went wide. Then she began to laugh. Needless to say, Naruto was a bit confused. What's going on? Kurama heard you. He says tell that brat Naruto to shut up, I'm tired of listening to him talk about me. TCH, next time I see that furball I'm gonna teach him a lesson, Naruto grumbled. The Redeed grinned at him, but didn't really say anything, closing her eyes as she shifted into her meditation. Taking this as a cue to leave, Naruto glanced up at where the sun was in the sky. It was high above, which meant that it was probably about time to get to a meeting he was not really looking forward to. Looking at Kushina one more time, he bent down and gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead before heading off towards the Hokage's office. Enter. Quickly entering the room and closing the door behind him, Naruto took a look around. He wasn't surprised to see that he was one of only 3 people in the room, the other 2 being the Hokage and Orochimaru. A part of him was always antsy whenever the pale man was nearby, but over the years he had gotten used to it. He had been expecting to have some kind of confrontation with the man regarding the status of Anko, but surprisingly nothing happened. That made him wonder why Orochimaru had chosen the girl in the first place. The Anko from his time had remembered nothing about it, but had lost most of her memories of that time anyway and tried not to dwell on it. Ah, Naruto-kun. Thank you for showing up. Since you're both here, we can just go ahead and get started a little early. Naruto nodded his head as he stepped up next to Orochimaru, while the man himself replied with a quiet yes, sensei. Seeing them both standing there, Hiruzen leaned back slightly in his seat and crossed his arms over his chest. Orochimaru, would you like to explain the purpose behind your laboratories? The snake summoner's head tilted to the side slightly, but he appeared otherwise unperturbed. I've already explained their functions to you, sensei. Yes, about most of them. Hiruzen stared straight at his student. I'm talking about the 2 we discovered in Sector B4, as well as the one in C7. I don't recall you telling me anything about those. Naruto was trying to observe Orochimaru without appearing too obvious. Currently the man was acting as if there was nothing at all wrong. My apologies, sensei. These labs were not really being used for more than storage, so I didn't really think they needed to be mentioned. The Hokage simply sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. Perhaps I should start this conversation another way. Orochimaru-kun, let me formally introduce you to Uchiha Naruto, the Rakudame Hokage. Orochimaru turned to look at the blonde, first with surprise, but then pure confusion worked its way onto his face. Naruto would have laughed had the situation not been so serious. Roku? But didn't you just decide upon the Yondaime? Not to mention a Godame. Hiruzen chuckled, well, I know who the Godame might have been, but it's only a matter of waiting for the war to end before Minato takes up his position full-time. But let's not wander too far and instead cut to the chase. Naruto-kun is from the future and traveled to the past through the use of a very complex seal he discovered in the ruins of Uzoshiogakure. Orochimaru's eyes immediately began to glow. A seal, you say? Can we organize a group to go there and recover? The Hokage held up his hand, stalling the comment. I've already long since dispatched a team to destroy that particular ruin. Naruto-kun is the only one here with the knowledge, and it will die with him unless a situation arises where it is needed. Like the situation he found himself in before coming here. The pale man simply turned to Naruto, as if waiting for him to continue the explanation. Figuring he might as well, he began to explain, we were in the middle of the 4th Shinobi World War. We were losing. Badly. Konoha was losing? No. The entire world was losing. It was all of us against one madman. Orochimaru's eyebrows shot upwards before his eyes quickly narrowed. Are you trying to imply that it was me? No, you've been dead to the best of our knowledge. Or were dead, rather. For about a year before the war started. That comment completely stunned the man, who took an involuntary step backward. What? Dead? How? A man named Uchiha Sasuke. Orochimaru looked between the Hokage and the blonde, gauging both for a moment before speaking again. Am I to assume this little meeting is to ask me for my continued cooperation with whatever I'm doing in exchange for having this? Sasuke? Taken care of? That won't be necessary, Naruto began, since Sasuke will no longer exist as the person I knew him as. He was my classmate. But I'm from the future, remember? Yes, and? He's Uchiha Sasuke. I'm now Uchiha Naruto. Not to mention the fact that I've completely if unintentionally eliminated the chance of him returning to the way he was by marrying his mother. You mean? Uchiha Mikoto? Yes. My wife now was his mother in my past. She had married Uchiha Fugaku. I see. Orochimaru was eyeing him warily now. So what is my purpose for being here? Naruto sighed before sitting down in one of the chairs, trying to appear completely relaxed so that he wouldn't set the man any further on edge. If he made him bolt early, there would be no salvaging the situation. I convinced the old man here that, while you became a monster in my time, you were still a genius. You came up with many incredible techniques that could see quite a few useful and practical applications. The only problem was giving you something that would keep you interested, as you didn't truly become a monster until you started experimenting on children and newborns. Taking them from orphanages during the war and sometimes directly from their parents. Even I might have been able to overlook how distasteful that was if you had been taking them from places outside of Konoha. But you took them from in the village too. To Orochimaru's credit, even he looked rather shocked and sickened from what his counterpart had done. Apparently he hadn't fallen that far yet, which Naruto considered to be a very good thing. It's no secret that you had aspirations for the Hokage position, but I'm going to tell you now that you'll have to give that up. It would be pointless to put someone with your talent behind a desk, doing paperwork all day. After brainstorming a bit, the old man and I have come up with a few ideas that we'd like to run by you. The two of them began explaining the situation to the snake summoner, starting from the very beginning of what they knew about him. Naruto had to fill in most of the information based upon the Orochimaru that he knew once upon a time. While they were adamant about him not experimenting on young children anymore, they were still alright with experiments, so long as there were no abductions. Asking for volunteers and paying them for their service was something that even Hiruzen was willing to have the village fund to a certain extent. The Hokage was also willing to allow potentially lethal experiments on notoriously bad criminals, bandits, Nukenin and their ilk. But even that would be under strict observation. Essentially, we want you to be in charge of a new division within Konoha. You'll report directly to the Hokage, whoever the Jonin commander at the time is, and myself. You'll focus on medical advancements and the creation of advanced medical shinobi, while at times also operating under the radar and performing subterfuge. Orochimaru was sitting there, obviously absorbing all this with glee. The more they put on the table, the easier it was for him to marginalize the loss of having stricter experimentation constraints. The ability to do his own thing. We realize some experiments may be too risky to keep here in Konoha proper, Hiruzen began, so Naruto-kun had a pretty good idea. At one point once you left Konoha, you created a village of your own, called Sound in Ricefield Country. He says it wasn't a true village, but it was more a series of fortified bunkers and caves that you used for your operations. The pale man turned to look questioningly at the blonde, who nodded. It's true. I'd suggest that you recreate at least some of what it was soon after the war ends and make better use of the Fuma clan than you did last time around. Not only that, but I have a list of people who you should keep an eye out for that worked under you before and perhaps would be willing to again. Keep in mind a lot of them aren't even born yet, so you'll have to wait a few years for the largest bulking up of your division. Unlike when you made Sound, you'll have the backing of Konoha after this. A lot of the other villages will be upset with us making bases all over, but by the same token we've held back from this war because the other villages know how powerful we are now. Once we do enter the war, the ending will be swift and decisive, so no one will bat an eyelash when we tell them it's the best way to make sure peace is maintained. It was a stretch to ask the man to wait that long, not to mention how obvious it was that they were telling Orochimaru he could do his own thing outside of Konoha proper, so long as he didn't go against them. Naruto knew it, Hiruzen knew it, and it was obvious to the both of them that Orochimaru knew it. I see. Is there anything else? Naruto and Hiruzen looked at each other, and the Hokage gave the blonde a short shake of his head. Naruto turned to look at Orochimaru once again. Not right now, no. Start coming up with plans and pass it by us, and if you have any questions about the future you can ask me. I'll tell you what I can, but keep in mind that I would still like to keep things as close to the original timeline as possible so we can have some kind of warning about what will happen. There are already a bunch of things that have changed, so as time drags on, I'll be doing more guessing than anything else. I understand. Orochimaru looked towards the door and then back at the Hokage. If you'll excuse me, sensei, I have many plans to write down that I shall run by you and Naruto-san later. Am I permitted to ask Sanada and Jiraiya for assistance? So long as you do it tomorrow. My next meeting is with those two to bring them up to speed. Yes, sensei. Thank you. Orochimaru gave Hiruzen a quick bow before turning to Naruto and doing the same. Once done, he promptly moved to exit the room, likely excited about future prospects. I think that went well. Naruto nodded towards Hiruzen that it did. I was trying not to imagine all sorts of horrible scenarios. But since he'll be having constant consultations with the both of us, we will hopefully be able to keep him well behaved and helping us this time around. I agree. If not, I have confidence that you or I would be able to put him down. Anyway. Would you like to go get something to eat before our next meeting? Sure, anything in mind? Naruto began to stretch as he stood up from the chair, trying not to think about what he was told the last time Saratobi tried to put Orochimaru down. Well, rumor has it that there is this really good ramen stand that you and Minato often visit. Later. The meeting with the other two members of the Densetsu no Sannin went exactly as Naruto had expected it to. Jiraiya was all over him asking about the success of his novels, while Tsunade merely took it in stride, claiming that there were several suspicious things about him that never quite added up. Still, she chose to trust him considering his position in the village and the fact that her sensei obviously trusted him. It also explained why he insisted on continuing to use ridiculous nicknames for them. Their meeting was shorter than the one with Orochimaru, but no less important. Tsunade agreed to start a regimen and work with Orochimaru to get more medical ninja into their active roster, while Jiraiya had agreed with Naruto about finding Nagato once again before the Third War got into full swing. Hiruzen, meanwhile, was going to have a long talk with Danzo and try to keep any ideas out of his head about conspiring with Hanzo. Naruto was fuzzy on the details, but he gleaned enough from the chat he had with Nagato to know that it was one of the man's major turning points. If not the most important one. At least those meetings were interesting, if not only because he was changing fate, but because they were largely important, and he knew that doing these things now would make the future a better place. The meeting he was in now, sadly, was nowhere near as entertaining. All we were able to get from them, Mikoto-sama. My apologies. The blonde watched as his wife shook her head and sighed. It's understandable, Takeru-san. I can understand why they wouldn't want to move. I'll go talk to them tomorrow and see if we can come to an understanding. Is there anything else? No, Mikoto-sama. Very well. Dismissed. The young man named Takeru rose from his kneeling position, and upon offering Mikoto and Naruto both a quick bow, he left the room and closed the sliding door behind him. As soon as the footsteps of his departure completely disappeared, Mikoto let out a huge sigh and leaned back, sprawling across the floor. Tired? Naruto couldn't hold back a chuckle. Mikoto simply tossed him a half-hearted glare. Of course I am. Listening to people whine and complain would take it out of anyone. True. At least there isn't nearly as much when you first took over a year ago. All he got in response was a grunt, causing him to smile. It was true that there was less and less for her to do, which he interpreted as a good sign. They'd been making huge strides in getting the clan to be rather self-sufficient and not reliant on those in charge to take care of everything. There were still complicated matters that had to be brought before him and Mikoto, of course. However, they were slowly but surely shrinking in number. Naruto. His wife moaned as she stretched. Yes. Naruto graced her once again with an amused smile. Mikoto rolled over so that she was facing him. I've been doing some thinking lately. Naruto waited for her to continue, but she didn't. She had her eyes closed and an expectant expression on her face, as if she was waiting for him to ask. About? Her eyes immediately opened, and she smiled at him. I want to start a family. Having Anko around has been making me think about it more and more. The blonde felt his heart lurch at that comment. It had always been a dream of his, and there was no doubt whatsoever that they could afford to start a family, but he had made a habit of respecting Mikoto's wishes and rarely pushed his own ideas upon her unless she asked for them. He had been ready for a kid 6 months into their marriage, but Mikoto wanted to wait until they had the clan firmly under their control. She didn't want either of them to have to deal with a child on top of their current responsibilities. It was a good choice, as the stress from her taking on the leadership of the Uchiha clan could have posed problems to her health and that of her child. Something he wasn't willing to risk. Ninja life was already stressful enough. If you feel you're ready, then I'm good to start whenever you are. Really? Mikoto chuckled, and her smile turned into a sly grin as she adjusted herself from where she was laying. Rolling over completely, she got onto her hands and knees and started crawling towards him. What if I said I wanted to get started right now? Naruto's eyebrows had almost jumped up all the way to his hairline. What? Here? Are you serious? Mikoto was taking her time getting over to him, moving slow and sensuously while staring into his eyes. Where had the nervous Mikoto gone when they were first starting to get to know each other? Oh, right. That Mikoto had disappeared once she and Kushina had somehow gotten a hold of one of Jiraiya's Icha manuscripts. Probably one he had been proofreading for the man. Once she figured out exactly how much power she could hold over him, she never let it go. Not that he was complaining. Of course not. Shouldn't we at least? I don't know. Block the door? I have no more scheduled meetings. No one else should even be in the building. She had finally reached him and slowly pulled herself up by placing her hands on his shoulders. That's true, but isn't there always that one last person that shows up with an emergency when you least expect it? I'm still finding myself not really caring. Makoto had managed to climb up and into his lap now and straddled him, wrapping her long legs around his waist. Her hands began playing with the zipper on the front of his vest, slowly pulling it down. We do tend to make a lot of noise, you know? I haven't put up silencing seals around here, so don't you think thaw. His speech was cut off as Makoto forcefully kissed him, pressing her body up against his. The kiss itself only lasted for a few seconds before she pulled back and stared straight at him. I want a bed, darling. All it took was a quick one-handed seal and they almost immediately appeared in their bedroom. I guess it's a good thing I know how to use the Horatian. Just don't tell Minato yet, okay? The wink that followed caused a smile to break the look of surprise on Makoto's face, but even that smile turned into more of a perverted leer as she forcefully pushed him back on their bed. You want my silence? It will cost you. How much? At this point, Naruto knew she was just playing with him. He couldn't help but be drawn in and play along. Quite a lot, I'm afraid, Makoto whispered before she licked her lips. Climbing over him, she started tugging on the zipper of her own Jonin vest. I hope you're prepared because it's going to take all night to pay what you owe. End of chapter 14.